due to properties inherent in that matter, was able to self-transform itself. Due to properties inherent in that matter, was able to self-transform itself from this disordered state into the highly ordered state of the universe today. That life arose spontaneously, naturally, mechanistically from non-life on this planet. And all living things in the world today evolved from that first primeval cell. You see, by evolution, I am referring to the particles to people theory of evolution, the amoeba to man theory, or as I sometimes call it, the fish to Gish theory of evolution. So we understand, you see, ladies and gentlemen, by the theory of evolution, we are referring to these kind of changes, that extent of change. Not merely variations within populations or within species. We're not talking about those kind of changes. Creationists recognize that these changes do take place. Variations. The dogs freely interbreed with coyotes and wolves and jackals. That is, not freely, but they do interbreed and they do produce fertile offspring. They have been classified in separate species because ordinarily they do not interbreed, but they can, and they produce fertile offspring. So there's been a limited sorting out of the original created genes or gene pools. But evolutionists, on the other hand, postulate this tremendous overall change from particles to people. The creationists, on the other hand, say, no, this natural universe could not have generated itself. It could not have started in a disordered state and by natural processes, spontaneously, according to the laws of chemistry and physics, have transformed itself from that disordered state to the ordered state that we find today. We maintain that the origin of the order and complexity that we find in the universe today had to be the result of a creator external to and independent of the natural universe, a supernatural creator, an eternal, self-existent, self-maintaining creator. Naturally, mechanistically, this could not have happened. We believe that God the Creator created certain basic kinds of plants and animals. Now, as I've mentioned, there has been variation since creation within the circumscribed boundaries of these kinds, but no origin of one kind from another. For example, among the reptiles, we find snakes, lizards, crocodiles, and turtles. We believe each was separately created. None have arisen from some other one of these reptiles. We believe that apes, monkeys, and men were separately created, that they did not arise by some mechanistic, naturalistic process from a common ancestor. Now, as I've mentioned, neither one of these positions are truly scientific. Norman Macbeth, who is an evolutionist, published an article recently in American Biology Teacher, November 1976. Norman Macbeth is an evolutionist. In this article, he says, Darwinism is not science. Almost all modern scientists subscribe to Karl Popper's dictum that the scientific status of a theory depends upon its falsifiability or refutability or testability. If a theory cannot be tested, it is non-scientific. It may be correct, but there is no way of knowing whether it is right or wrong, and therefore it is not in the realm of science. And then he goes on to quote L.C. Birch and Paul Ehrlich, two evolutionary biologists, in Nature, volume 214 in 1967, and these evolutionists pointed out that evolution is not within the limits of empirical science because it is incapable of test, just as is creation. L. Harrison Matthews, in the introduction to a 1971 edition of The Origin of Species, published by Dent and Sons of London, Dr. Matthews is an evolutionist, fellow of the Royal Society. He says that in this introduction that the theory of evolution is exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts that believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. Furthermore, the theory of evolution is just as religious as is creation. You see, each involve a commitment to a particular worldview. You must decide how you are going to interpret our natural universe. Are you going to demand that the origin of this universe be determined, or to be our speculation on the origin of the universe must be restricted to purely mechanistic, materialistic theories? Is it to be restricted to that point of view? Or is it true that God does exist, and if God exists, then creation is not only plausible and logical and possible, I believe it's inevitable. But you see, to insist that when it comes to origin we must teach only evolution or consider evolution, that is demanding that all of us be atheists when we consider origins. And that, of course, is totally unreasonable. Now, when I go in the laboratory as a biochemist, of course, I expect what I see today to happen tomorrow and 1,000 years later, and it happened 1,000 years before. Of course, we cannot operate as scientists unless we make that assumption. But when it comes to origins, you see, ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with something very, very different. We're dealing with ultimate beginnings, with ultimate meaning. And there, you see, that is a very different situation. And creation is absolutely one of the alternatives that we must consider. But evolution today has become sort of a religion. The American Humanist Society defining humanism as a non-theistic religion, and then in their literature they go on to quote Sir Julian Huxley, who says that a humanist is one who believes that man is just a natural phenomenon like any other plant or animal, that he's not the product of a supernatural creator, but that he is the product of evolution. You see, evolution is the dogma of humanists and atheists. Now, certainly, I do not wish to imply at all that all evolutionists are humanists or atheists, or Dr. Kirkwood, or anyone else here in this auditorium hold those views. I'm just saying this: to teach evolution exclusively, to hold that position exclusively, convinces millions of our young people that there is no God, that they're merely a mechanistic product of a mindless universe, and they're solely responsible to themselves. Now, I disagree with that, and I know many of you do. We are just pleading for both views to be presented, and not on the basis of the book of Genesis or the Bible, not in our pluralistic society, not in our public schools, but on the basis of the available scientific evidence within the general creation model versus the general evolution model. Now, of course, as I mentioned already, one or the other must be true. The only suggestions that I've heard about how we got here ultimately are creation and evolution. So whether they are scientific theories or not, whether ultimately either can be tested or proved, yet one or the other must be true. We can discuss them in scientific terms. We can consider them as conceptual schemes or as models within which we are going to attempt to explain origins. Now, then after we've described our models, what we believe happened, then on the basis of these models we can attempt to make predictions about what we'd expect to find out there in the real world, in the natural world, among natural laws, and what we would expect to find in the fossil record. Or we might call them retrodictions. At least we can describe what we should expect. What should we expect, first of all, among the natural laws, if evolution is true? And what should we expect if creation is true? What should we expect as far as probability considerations are concerned? What should we expect as far as the fossil record is concerned? That's what we're going to do tonight. We are going to describe these predictions or expectations on the basis of each model, compare them to the actual scientific evidence, and then we want you to decide which seems to be more credible, creation or evolution. Which should enjoy the greatest confidence level, creation or evolution. Now, the evolutionists and the creationists, I repeat, are reaching into the same data bank We are looking at the same scientific evidence, the same facts. There's no question what the facts are generally. It's the conclusions that we seek to draw from those facts is where we differ. Now, if evolution is true, if we started with some primordial cosmic egg, now nobody has the foggiest notion where it came from or how it got there, but there it was, and it exploded. And some billions of years later, here we are, people containing 30 trillion cells in our bodies, 12 billion of those found in the 3-pound human brain, and each one of these 12 billion brain cells being connected to 10,000 other brain cells in the most incredible arrangement of matter imaginable. That means there's 120 trillion connections in the human brain alone. 120 trillion connections. Now that's an incredible increase in order and complexity. If that has happened, if we started with electrons, protons, and neutrons, and it exploded and gave rise to this incredibly complex universe and living things that we have today, then matter must have some inherent ability to self-organize itself and to self-transform itself from a disordered state to higher and higher levels of complexity, and giving rise to our universe, to life on this planet and all living things. If that's true, then matter must have this inherent ability to self-organize itself and to self-transform itself into higher and higher levels of complexity. And scientists should have recognized this ability. We should find that described today in some natural law or some set of natural laws. On the other hand, if the creation model is true, which postulates that God created and would have created perfect in the beginning, if any change has taken place since that time, if there has been any vertical change at all, it could only be downward, it could only be deteriorative. We might expect some deteriorative processes operating, but we'd not expect any upward process, any creative processes. On the basis of evolution, of course, you would expect both. Some deteriorative processes, some processes integrating or leading to ever and ever higher levels of complexity. But if we start with particles and end up with people, of course there was this tremendous upward movement. Well, as a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, no scientist has ever recognized any such property of matter. There are no natural laws which describes an inherent ability of matter to self-organize itself and to promote itself spontaneously and naturally into higher and higher levels of complexity and order. There are no such laws known in science. But there is a law of science. And if there is a law of science, this is one that describes exactly the opposite property in matter. And that is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that spontaneously and naturally everything tends to go towards a disordered state. The more probable state of matter is always the random state. That is always the more probable state of matter. There is this order, going from order to disorder, from the complex to the simple. That is what is going on in this universe today. Let me quote a few scientists, experts in thermodynamics, and their description of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please understand, scientists just don't sit down and write laws and command nature to obey. They've gone out there and see what happens in nature, and then on the basis of what's really happening in the world, they describe these laws. That is, if it never fails. R.B. Lindsay, an American scientist, volume 56, 1968, said, quote, "There is a general natural tendency of all observed systems to go from order to disorder, reflecting dissipation of energy available for future transformation. The law of increasing entropy," end of quote. So Dr. Lindsay says there's a general natural tendency of all observed systems to go from order to disorder. Dr. Harold Blum, American scientist, October 1955, said, quote, "All real processes go with an increase of entropy. The entropy also measures the randomness or lack of orderliness of the system. The greater the randomness, the greater the entropy." End of quote. So Blum says all real processes, that is all processes that occur spontaneously, naturally, all by themselves, go with an increase of entropy, the entropy measuring the randomness of the system. Finally, Isaac Asimov, Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970, says, quote, "Another way of stating the second law, then, is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, then we see what is going on in this natural universe. Right now, in this point in time, the universe is constantly becoming more and more disorderly. The fuel in the sun is being exhausted at the rate of several billion tons every second. Eventually, the sun will grow dark and cold, and all the stars will burn out, and life in the universe will cease unless God intervenes. That is the ultimate destiny of the universe. That's where everything is going today. Here we see this process working at every level, the macro level, the micro level, everywhere in the universe, everywhere that we have been able to observe and test, we see this downward process. And yet, evolutionists say we've had a tremendous process, the greatest process in this tremendous universe, starting with chaos and ending up with cosmos, starting with disorder and ending up with order. It seems to me we have a contradiction here. Evolution says we're going this way. The second law says we're going this way. As a scientist, ladies and gentlemen, I opt for scientific laws rather than this speculative theory of evolution. I think it's rational. It is scientific to accept the fact there must be a supernatural creator external to our universe. Naturally, the universe could not have generated itself. Now, evolutionists often say, well, you know, the second law only applies to closed systems, isolated systems. If you have an open system into which you can introduce energy from the outside, then you can have evolution, which is feeding on this energy. Now, overall, you get a downward process, but locally and temporarily, you can get an increase in order. And after all, our Earth is open to the sun. It is receiving energy. And so there's no contradiction. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's an incredibly naive and totally unsatisfactory explanation. Yes, some open systems can increase in order and complexity. That is possible. But what kind of open systems? Just the hypothetical primitive Earth with this ultraviolet light, deadly, destructive ultraviolet light penetrating down to the surface of the Earth? Would that build up complex molecules and a living thing from simple gases? Absolutely not. It would destroy anything if it were there. In order to build up complex things from simple things in any system, you must have, first of all, some machinery, some system, some energy conversion mechanism that takes that raw, uncontrolled, otherwise destructive energy and converts it into a useful form that can be utilized by the system. Now, in the green plant, we have that system, photosynthesis, as well as many other metabolic motors, which allows the absorption of radiant energy, conversion to chemical energy, and the utilization of that energy using many other metabolic motors to build up complex things from simple things. That is possible when you have the machinery in existence. Furthermore, you must have something controlling, operating, and maintaining that machinery. In the green plant, ultimately, that's a genetic system. It turns things on, turns things off, regulates, operates, and maintains that machinery, and eventually reproduces it or replicates it. That is, the whole cell replicates itself. Now, when you have these four conditions, an open system, adequate energy, energy conversion machines or mechanisms, and a control system, yes, it is possible to build up complex things. Automobile factories do that. They do it every day. But we have within that automobile factory the machines, the assembly line, the humans, and so forth. They're present. But the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, machines don't spontaneously arise. It takes a machine to build a machine, and something or somebody has to operate the machinery. Now, when evolutionists talk as scientists, they realize this fact. Sometimes they forget to speak as evolutionists and speak as scientists. Dr. George Gaylord Simpson, famous evolutionist who does believe that life has evolved, in his book, Life, An Introduction to Biology, that's by Simpson and Beck, on page 466 makes the following statement, quote, "The simple expenditure of energy is not sufficient to develop and maintain order. A bull in a china shop performs work, but he neither creates nor maintains order. The work needed is particular work. It must follow specifications. It requires information on how to proceed." End of quote. Precisely, exactly what the creations are saying. Now, on that hypothetical primitive earth, where were these machines? Where was the control system? Where was the specifications on how to proceed? What was there to tell those amino acids in what order to arrange themselves to have enzymes and structural proteins and hormones and things like that? Where were the instructions to tell this system how to organize proteins and DNA and RNA and all this system into complex systems? How could it happen spontaneously? It could not. Spontaneously, if you have a system, it deteriorates, it degenerates. Now, if anybody thinks you can beat the second law of thermodynamics, if you think an open system is the answer, then why don't you live forever? You are an open system. You can take in all the energy that you need. You're the most sophisticated machine in this universe. You can't beat the second law of thermodynamics. Nobody can beat the second law of thermodynamics. You are aging, you are going to die, and you'll decay to a pile of dust. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's no solution to this dilemma. There's an irresolvable dilemma here. No natural system can order itself, isolated, open, or otherwise. If it has machinery and so forth and so on, yes, it can exist temporarily, but eventually it wears out and goes back to dust. Now, at least evolutionists would maintain that the universe is an isolated system. At least the atheist would say this, that there is no God external to the universe. It is an isolated system, but it's a highly organized system, highly ordered system. It is an isolated system. Now, no isolated natural system can self-order itself. That's impossible by everything we know in science. And yet the universe did get wound up. How did it get wound up? It could not have wound itself up. It could not have done that, not by anything we know in science. Therefore, we believe the rational scientific answer is that there is a supernatural creator who's responsible for the order and complexity within the natural universe. Now, let us touch briefly upon the probabilistic considerations that are involved here. Huxley and others have estimated that the improbability of getting a horse from a single-cell organism by pure chance alone is 1 chance out of 1,000 to the millionth power. That's 1 followed by 3 million zeros. That would take 3 large volumes of 500 pages each just to print. Of course, Huxley says that's impossible. No one would ever bet on anything like this happening by pure chance alone. But he says natural selection made it happen. Natural selection overcame these impossible odds. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when I say impossible odds, I mean impossibly impossible. 1 followed by 3 million zeros? Why, ladies and gentlemen, you know how big that number is? How big is 1 followed by 130 zeros? 10 to the 130th power. Well, if you cram this known universe, that is the visible universe, what scientists believe about the universe, 5 billion light years in radius, if you can't cram it absolutely jam-packed solid with electrons, with no space left over, you can get 10 to the 130th power electrons in the universe. 1 followed by 130 zeros. And if you pack 1 trillion universes full of electrons, that would only be 10 to the 142nd power, 1 followed by 142 zeros. 1 trillion universes. Now you can imagine how big the number 1 followed by 3 million zeros. That's the improbability of getting the horse by pure chance alone without natural selection. But Huxley says it has happened thanks to the workings of natural selection. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no natural process that could overcome odds of that kind. Absolutely impossible. Natural selection has become the god of the evolutionists, obviously of Huxley, if he says it can overcome odds of that kind. Now, not all evolutionists are convinced. A number of mathematicians have challenged the theory of evolution. That is, the modern theory. They accept evolution philosophically. They're not creationists, but they're simply saying this modern theory of evolution, based ultimately as it is on random chance mutations, which are mistakes. According to evolutionists, you and I have been produced as a result of millions and millions and millions of mistakes. Now, most of these mistakes were bad, deleterious, weeded out by natural selection, but just by pure chance, rarely a good mutation happens. And just by chance confers some advantage on a plant or animal, changing in an incredibly slightly way. Takes a long time then for natural selection to allow this favorable mutant to replace the original. And that is the way evolution is supposed to have happened, through these random chance mistakes. Well, even some evolutionists are not convinced. Now, the Wistar Institute in 1966 brought together a group of these mathematicians with the evolutionary biologists. The biologists to defend their theory of evolution, the mathematicians to attack it. They were all evolutionists. The Wistar Institute published the results of that symposium in 1967 in a book called Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. One of those mathematicians was Dr. Murray Eden of MIT. On page 109 of that book, Dr. Eden says, quote, "It is our contention that if random is given a serious and crucial interpretation from a probabilistic point of view, the randomness postulate is highly implausible, and that an adequate scientific theory of evolution must await the discovery and elucidation of new natural laws, physical, chemical, and biological." End of quote. Dr. Eden is saying this: if randomness, and that is given a crucial interpretation, and it is in the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, all mutations are random. Not natural selection, of course, but the what produces, what must be selected, is produced randomly. And it's crucial. And he says if that's true, then this postulate is highly implausible. They're saying you could only produce trivial changes in some 3 billion years by such a process, and to get a man from an amoeba or some primitive cell would require billions of times longer than 3 billion years. Billions of times longer. They're saying, therefore, this modern theory of evolution is impossible, and he hopes that someday we'll discover some new laws that will tell us how evolution could have been possible. But he says right now, by what we know about science, this modern theory is impossible. Well, this is what creationists have been saying all the time. Creationists say this incredibly complex living things that we have on this earth today could not have arisen mechanistically, naturalistically, by chance, by any process utilizing natural selection or anything else in 3 billion years. It's been absolutely impossible. And now we find evolutionists agreeing with us on that count. Minority perhaps, but nevertheless, highly intelligent, well-qualified scientists. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, evolutionists say, well, in spite of all this, after all, don't we know from the fossil record that evolution has taken place? Don't we have the record inscribed in the rocks that demonstrate the fact of evolution? Well, as a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, the fossil record is an embarrassment to evolution. Darwin recognized this. He recognized the problem, but he ascribed it to the poverty of the fossil record. He hoped that someday, with further searching, that what is lacking, what they need to demonstrate evolution, would be found. But ladies and gentlemen, the past 100 years has not produced the evidence sought for by evolutionists. But this searching has merely emphasized the nature of the gap and the nature of the evidence. Now, if evolution is true, then the oldest rocks which contain fossils must contain fossils of the simplest forms of life, capable of leaving a fossil record. And then as we search out what evolutionists believe to be younger and younger rocks, younger and younger strata, we must find a slow gradual change of these simple forms of life into more and more complex forms of life. And if millions of species have very, very slowly and gradually evolved through millions of years of time, hundreds of millions of years of time, then the fossil record must contain a vast number of transitional forms. Just think, 30 million years for a fish to evolve into an amphibian, during which time supposedly the fin of the fish slowly and gradually changed the feet and legs of the amphibian. 100 million years is assumed for some invertebrate to evolve into the backboned animal, slowly and gradually. Think of the enormous number of transitional forms that must have existed, lived and died during those many, many millions of years. Why, the number of intermediate forms between a fish and an amphibian would be literally billions times billions, and perhaps times billions again. Now, if you're going to find fossils at all, you must find some transitional forms. Here's 30 million years. How can you miss? 100 million years of evolution of an invertebrate to a vertebrate. How can you miss? Now, you may dig down in a particular rock, which evolutionists believe represents some time zone, and perhaps by that time the fish has completed its evolution to the amphibian, and you'd find complete amphibian. But remember, at that same time, supposedly hundreds and thousands of other species were in the process of evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, if you find fossils at all, you've got to find transitional forms, and tremendous numbers of transitional forms. Our museum should be full of transitional forms. There should be no question, no dispute, no discussion whatsoever on this point. There should be vast numbers of evident transitional forms if evolution is true. But what if creation is true? Well, if creation is true, we'd expect to see an explosive appearance of highly complex plants and animals for which we could find no evolutionary ancestor. We'd expect to find fossils of the various kinds, the phyla, classes, orders, families, and so forth, but no transitional form. We'd expect to find fossils of fishes and fossils of these invertebrates, soft-bodied or shelled animals, but no transitional form. We'd expect to find fossils of apes, monkeys, and men, but no transitional form. This is what we'd expect on the basis of creation. Now, you see, the contrast is very sharp. Its difference is night and day. It should be an easy thing to dig up the fossils, study them, and decide which is more credible, creation or evolution. And when that is done, I am convinced that the evidence is solidly in support of creation. Now, may I have that first slide? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to show a few slides to demonstrate the nature of the fossil record. Then I want to quote from some of the leading evolutionary scientists as to the general nature of the fossil record. Now, if we dim some of these lights, some of these spotlights, we'll see the screen a little bit better. Here on this screen, on this slide, we see the kind of animals found in Cambrian rocks: trilobites, sea urchins, branching sponges, jellyfish, swimming crustaceans, of great variety of very highly complex creatures. This slide I obtained from the American Museum of Natural History of the Cambrian animals. Evolutionists believe that these rocks were formed beginning 600 million years ago. And we find this tremendously diverse numbers of very highly complex animals. Animals so complex that the evolutionary biologists estimate that their origin would have required about 2.5 billion years, somewhere between 2 and 3 billion years. But ladies and gentlemen, in the so-called pre-Cambrian rocks, there's not one single indisputable multicellular fossil. Perhaps some microscopic, soft-bodied, single-cell organisms, such as bacteria and algae, but nothing, nowhere on the face of the earth has anyone ever found the evolutionary ancestors of these creatures. They appear as if they came out of nowhere, already fully formed, with no evolutionary ancestors. And the pre-Cambrian rocks, many of them are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. But nowhere do we find the evolutionary ancestors of these creatures. This is precisely, you see, what we expect on the basis of creation. An explosive appearance of very highly complex animals for which we can find no ancestors, no transitional forms between any of these various kinds. Furthermore, it is, as I mentioned, estimated that it took 100 million years for one of these to evolve into a vertebrate. Now, nobody knows which ones. Every one of these has been suggested one time or the other as the ancestor of the vertebrates. 100 million years of evolution, ladies and gentlemen, not a single transitional form between an invertebrate and a vertebrate. Nothing, not a single transitional form, questionable, unquestionable, or otherwise. And the major kind of fishes appear abruptly, the different kind of fishes. I have with me an article published by Dr. Errol White, an evolutionist, in Proceedings of the Linnean Society of London, January 1966. It's on lungfishes. Dr. White is an expert on fishes. And on page 8 of that article, Dr. White, this evolutionist, says, quote, "But whatever ideas authorities may have on this subject, the lungfishes, like every other major group of fishes that I know, have their origins firmly based in nothing." And he italicizes the word nothing to emphasize it. These fishes, no matter what kind of a fish it is, every major group of fishes that Dr. White knows anything about has their origins firmly based in nothing. Next slide, please. Now, on this slide, you see the fish that supposedly gave rise to the amphibian. And here is what is supposed to be the world's oldest amphibian. I took these from the book by Alfred S. Romer, Vertebrate Paleontology, 3rd edition. This is a Crossopterygian fish, and this is supposed to be the world's oldest amphibian. Now, you see the complete difference between the two. That was a fish, highly adapted or designed for life in the water, with a beautiful set of fins. On the other hand, this amphibian has a basic amphibian limb, feet and legs, and there are no transitional forms. Nothing between those fins and those feet and legs. Evolutionists chose that fish because the bones were found in the fins, which they believed could be transformed into feet and legs. Because he had 3 other fins, which he had to get rid of, I guess, but these supposedly evolved into feet and legs. But you see the tremendous difference, ladies and gentlemen. Now, wait a minute. 30 billion years of evolution. We find the fishes, we find the amphibians, why not the intermediate form? But none have been found, and the anatomy is very different. There's no walking fish, by the way, living or fossil. There's no walking fish. Walking catfish of Florida don't walk. They cannot support the weight of the body on those fins. You notice that the pelvic bones of the fish are very small and loosely embedded in muscle, no connection to the vertebral column. No way can those fins support the weight of the body. They're not made for it. Very different from the amphibian. Now, another thing, that fish supposedly became extinct 70 million years ago. That is, that's what evolutionists used to believe until 1939, when it was found to be alive and well off the coast of Africa. Next slide, please. And here is the fish. There is the fish, ladies and gentlemen, and it's supposed to be our ancestor, at least his cousin, evolved all the way up to man through the various intermediates. But here he is, very much the same old fish. Next slide, please. Here's the animal that supposedly gave rise to dinosaurs, flying reptiles, and, at least according to Romer, to birds. Next slide, please. And here, quickly, are some of the dinosaurs. Triceratops, a 3-horned dinosaur with a tremendous armor plate. All of the horned dinosaurs appearing abruptly with the horns fully formed. Next slide, please. The Stegosaurus, he was a horned dinosaur, but not on the skull, but back here on the tail. And you notice those very unique plates, very unique dinosaur. The plated dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, the spiked dinosaurs, all appear fully formed. Next slide, please. And here's the Trachodon, one of the duck-billed dinosaurs, supposedly jaws and teeth slowly and gradually change into a duck-bill. That is the front part of it. Very unique, but not one single transitional form for any of these duck-billed dinosaurs. This one standing about 18 feet tall. Next slide, please. And here is one of the carnivorous dinosaurs. Now we know why they call these things terrible lizards, and that's what dinosaur means. Tyrannosaurus rex, having jaws 6 feet long, teeth 6 inches long. Tremendous creatures, but no transitional form. Next slide, please. Here's a brontosaurus, 40 tons of steaks, roast, and hamburger, walking around on 4 feet. About 80 feet long, a tremendous creature, but no transitional form, showing the evolution from some little fellow. Next slide. And here's the most mammoth dinosaur of all, Brachiosaurus, standing 40 feet high. Tremendous creature with the nostrils not in the snout, but in that bony dome on the top of the head. A most unusual dinosaur, weighing 80 to 90 tons, 160,000 to 180,000 pounds, but no transitional form. I have a book called The Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs. Every single dinosaur that's ever been found and described is found there, and I know from my study of that book, we have no transitional form for these creatures. Next slide, please. Here's one of the flying reptiles, one of the 4 classes of animals that fly or did fly. These are extinct, of course. Flying reptiles, flying insects, flying mammals or bats, and birds. Remarkable transformation. Let's see what we can find. Here is the flying reptile, a pterodactyl. Notice the 4th finger, very, very long. Supposedly evolution made that finger start getting longer and got longer and longer and longer and longer. And the wing membrane developed, flight muscles, hollow bones, all by a Curious combination of mistakes finally producing this creature. Next slide, please. And here's another flying reptile, a pteranodon, toothless beak 3 feet long, bony crest about 3 feet long, and a fourth finger supporting wingspread of up to 52 feet, 14 feet long on the F-4 Phantom jet. Remarkable creature. Ladies and gentlemen, not a trace of a transitional form has ever been found in the fossil record for these flying reptiles. Next slide, please. And here's Archaeopteryx. Here's the showcase of evolution. Here is the transitional form, so-called, that is always brought out by evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, look, if evolution is true, if millions of species have evolved through hundreds of millions of years of time, there'd be no question, no dispute. I mean, there'd be so many transitional forms, there'd be absolutely no question about it. But evolutionists come back again and again and again to Archaeopteryx to say this proves evolution. Archaeopteryx, as you can see, was a bird. He had wings, he was completely feathered, and those feathers were as complex as the feathers in a modern bird. They were identical to the feathers of a modern bird. When you see feathers, you see feathers. You don't see halfway feathers. When you see teeth, you see teeth. You don't see halfway teeth. When you see any structure in the fossil record, it is complete and not halfway. Now, evolutionists point to some so-called reptilian features in this bird. Now, I have to admit, ladies and gentlemen, if I were an evolutionist, if I were convinced, as a matter of fact, that animals had evolved, I would tend to read into this kind of material, the kind of evidence, what they read into it. For example, they note that this bird contains teeth, had teeth, and it had claws on the wings. Well, of course, they say that those came from the reptilian ancestor. Reptiles have teeth, and they have claws. But now, wait a minute, let's take a little closer look at that. Let's take a look at the data from the creationist point of view. What about the teeth? Well, it's true that modern birds don't have teeth, but it's also true that there were other ancient birds which had no teeth. Some had teeth and some didn't. There are nothing intermediate. There are no transitional forms showing the gradual disappearance of the teeth. After all, isn't this what we find in all subclasses of the vertebrates? Some fishes have teeth, some don't. Some reptiles have teeth, some don't. Some amphibians have teeth, some don't. Most mammals have teeth, some don't. Most of you have teeth, some don't. But the presence or absence of teeth does not necessarily demonstrate evolution from a reptile. We have teeth. Does that prove that we evolved from reptiles? Of course it does not. What about the claws? Next slide, please. Here's the adult Hoatzin living in South America today, very much a bird, but it has claws. Next slide, we see the juvenile Hoatzin has 2 claws. There's one there, right there, and there's the other one up there. This bird has claws. If we could find it as a fossil, I suppose someone would claim it as a transitional form, but it is very much a bird living in the world today. The turaco of Africa has claws, and the ostrich has 3 claws, every bit as much as reptilian, if that's what you want to call them, as the claws of Archaeopteryx. But it's very much a bird alive in this world today. Now, Dr. W.E. Swinton, an expert on birds. Dr. Swinton is not only an expert on birds, he's an expert on reptiles. He states that there is no fossil evidence showing the origin of birds. In the book Comparative Biology and Comparative Physiology of Birds, published by Academic Press in 1960, in Volume 1, Chapter 1, Page 1, this evolutionist, this expert on birds, says, quote, "The origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved." End of quote. Even though he believed that birds have evolved from reptiles, he says there is no fossil evidence of this. Next slide, please. And here's the bat, and you see it's a flying mammal, supposedly evolved from a non-flying mammal. And if that's true, then we ought to find a few intermediates. Next slide, please. Well, here's the world's oldest known bat, at least according to evolutionists. This was taken from the cover page of Science, December 9, 1966. The article accompanying this picture claimed these bones were found in rocks 50 million years old. They said nothing related to a bat any older than this has ever been found. All right, ladies and gentlemen, according to evolutionists, then here is the world's oldest known bat, or anything related to a bat. Here in the center of the picture, we see the actual bones of this bat, and here we see what the bat would have looked like if it had been clothed with flesh. All right, there you have him, ladies and gentlemen, according to evolutionists, the world's oldest bat. And what is he? 100% bat. He's not 50%, 75%, 95%. He is essentially morphologically identical to a modern bat. He appears abruptly, fully formed, no ancestors, no transitional forms, and no change since he appeared. This also is true of the insects. Evolutionists argue among themselves, what on an insect gave rise to wings? Find one single transitional form and you settle the argument. They have found no transitional forms for flying insects, for the birds, for flying reptiles, or flying mammals. And we see then, time and time and time again, this is what we find in the fossil record. Let me quote from a plant scientist, or I should show you just a few more slides, ladies and gentlemen, the track record of evolutionists on the origin of man. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please, I don't do this to poke fun at evolutionists, but I think it illustrates something very important. What you see, scientists tend to find what they're looking for, whether it's there or not. We have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the shortcomings of human beings, including scientists. Now, one example is that of the famous Piltdown man. Next slide, please. Here we see the famous Piltdown man, taken from Life magazine, 1937. On a jaw, a few fragments of a jaw, and a few fragments of a skull found in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England. The skull and the jawbone were put together to make the famous Piltdown man. The jawbone was rather ape-like, and yet the teeth supposedly were man-like. The skull was rather man-like, and yet they could see remarkable primitive features in that skull. And they appeared to be quite old. And this was the evolutionary form of man that graced our textbooks for nearly a half a century, accepted by the world's greatest authorities, Robert Broom, Sir Arthur Keith, Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, G. Elliott Smith, particularly the British scientists who had studied these remains. But in 1950, it was shown to be a complete hoax. Somebody had taken a jaw of a modern chimpanzee, stained them with salts to make them look old, filed the teeth to make them look man-like, did the same for the skull, stained it and planted it in a gravel pit and fooled the world's greatest experts. There, ladies and gentlemen, is your evolutionary ancestor based upon a modern ape's jaw and a recent human skull. Next slide, please. And here is the famous Nebraska man. A tooth was found in western Nebraska in 1922, brought to the attention of Henry Fairfield Osborn, one of the greatest authorities of that time. He was very excited by this tooth, and his colleagues as well. It seemed to be something they'd associate with a primitive man at least. And so this became the famous Nebraska man. And here you see the picture of the man. Oh, by the way, this is a picture in the Illustrated London News in 1922, based upon the descriptions of the scientists. You see the man, his wife, the tools that they use, and everything else based upon that single tooth. Remarkable, isn't it, what scientists can do? Well, a few years later, ladies and gentlemen, they found the postcranial skeleton of that creature. It turned out to be neither a man-like ape or an ape-like man. It turned out to be a pig. That's right, it turned out to be a pig. You'll find that in the December 13th, 1927 issue of Science magazine. It turned out to be a pig. Look at that picture, ladies. These people were honest, sincere scientists, capable in their particular field. And yet that was the evolutionary figure of man based upon a pig's tooth. Now I say this, ladies and gentlemen, if scientists can make a man out of a pig's tooth and a man out of an ape's jaw, it's no real challenge to make a man out of some kind of an ape, or monkey or what. It's extremely fragmentary evidence. It's no real challenge at all, you see. Now the next slide will show the famous Neanderthal man. That was the original picture of Neanderthal man, very crude, very primitive, you see, a long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged, subhuman, Homo neanderthalensis. Found in 1908, the complete skeleton. There are other fragments found much earlier. Dr. Virchow, a famous anatomist, says, now wait a minute, fellows, the skeleton on which you based Neanderthal man is of an arthritic old man. He didn't walk upright simply because he had a bad case of arthritis. Well, nobody paid any attention to Dr. Virchow, and so this was a picture that graced our textbooks. Later on, other skeletons of Neanderthal man were found fully erect. It was proven beyond doubt that this was an arthritic old man. Furthermore, the x-rays, the bones and teeth of Neanderthal man showed that all these creatures suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency. And now it has been concluded that the so-called primitive features of Neanderthal were not genetic, but were environmental, nutritional, and pathological. And he's classified today Homo sapiens. And two anthropologists published an article about 15 years ago in which they said, if you would give Neanderthal man a shave and a haircut and a bath and put him in a business suit, no one would take a second look. Well, of course, today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut. And in many circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath, and he'd fit in pretty nicely. But he is homeless. And please, ladies and gentlemen, understand, I have nothing against beards or anything like that. But this was a statement of these anthropologists. Well, so we see, ladies and gentlemen, the nature of this evidence. And we just wish we had time to deal with many specific examples. But let me quote now from a few of the evolutionary scientists, the general nature of the fossil record. In the book Contemporary Botanical Thought, published in 1961 by Quadrangle Books, we find a chapter by E.J.H. Corner, an evolutionary botanist of the University of Cambridge University. He's an evolutionist. He does believe that plants have evolved. But he says in that chapter, quote, much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology, but I still think that to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation. End of quote. So Dr. Corner says the fossil record of plants does not favor evolution but creation. Major kinds of plants appear abruptly without ancestors and without transitional form, just as we'd expect on the basis of creation. Now, as to the general nature of the fossil record, and ladies and gentlemen, if I had time, I could quote many other sources, but let me quote Dr. David B. Kitts, professor of geology at the University of Oklahoma, a man who received his training in vertebrate paleontology under George Gaylord Simpson, the world's most famous evolutionist. Dr. Kitts is an evolutionist. He published this article in Evolution, Volume 28, 1974. It's entitled Paleontology and Evolutionary Theory. That is, the fossil record and evolutionary theory. On page 467, Dr. Kitts says, quote, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. End of quote. This evolutionist says evolution requires intermediate forms and the fossil record does not provide them. Now here is an evolutionist, ladies and gentlemen, that is frank enough, candid enough to say, now look fellows, this is the way it really is. We've got a problem. We have to seek some spatial explanation to explain why we're transitional forms, even though evolution has taken place. The creationist says, of course we don't have transitional forms because evolution did not take place, and we would not expect to find these transitional forms. Well, we could quote many sources. Let me quote finally, I wished I had more time to deal with the origin of man, but Lord Zuckerman, Sir Solly Zuckerman, is a famous British anatomist that has done tremendous research on the origin of man. He's the man who did many, many years of research on Australopithecus, our supposed ape-like ancestor. His research demonstrated that that was an anthropoid ape and not a hominid or a man-like ape, as is commonly taught today. Nobody has paid any attention to Lord Zuckerman. On page 64 of his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970, Lord Zuckerman, Sir Solly Zuckerman, an evolutionist. Now, he's not a creationist. He says on page 64 of that book, quote, no scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. End of quote. So this evolutionist, this expert on the fossil ancestry of man, a man who's done tremendous amount of research, says, now if you exclude the possibility of creation, then no scientist could logically dispute the fact that man has evolved from an ape-like creature without leaving a trace in the fossil record. Very much different kind of a story than we find in our textbooks. Finally, Dr. Jeffrey Bourne, director of the Yerkes Regional Primate Research Center at Emory University, because of the nature of the most recent evidence, this scientist, a very famous scientist and an evolutionist, is suggesting now that they have been wrong all the time in believing that man has evolved from an ape-like creature. Dr. Bourne is now saying that apes and monkeys have evolved from man. When I replied, I'll be a monkey's uncle. But ladies and gentlemen, the incredible thing is that The incredible thing is that evolutionists look at the same data. Some evolutionists believe that man have evolved from an ape-like creature, and others suggesting that apes have evolved from man. I think something is basically wrong with their model and their assumptions. I believe all the evidence, thermodynamics, probability, and the fossil record and other areas of science fully support the concept of Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. And now, as I announced regarding our format, we will take 5 minutes to stretch and relax. But let me suggest that this might be a good time to get out the question card, which is in your program, and write a question for Dr. Gish, because we'll be collecting these immediately following the second address.
I got up there at 7:15, perhaps a little later.
No. Well, our watches are not quite jiving here, I guess. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please take your seats now? Will you please be seated? Before we begin the second half of the major speeches, I'd like to suggest something in regard to the question cards, a few of which have come to the front of the room. Will you please hold on to those cards until Dr. Kirkwood has completed his speech, and at that time we will collect them in the aisles. Dr. Sam Kirkwood will debate the negative side of the proposition. In other words, will argue that the theory of special creation is not superior to the theory of evolution. Dr. Kirkwood is a Canadian by birth. He is also a graduate of the University of Alberta, where he received the Bachelor of Science degree in 1942. He received the Master of Science and the PhD degrees in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin in 1944 and 1947, respectively. He served as professor of biochemistry at McMaster University, Hamilton, Ontario, from 1950 to 1956. He is currently professor of biochemistry at the University of Minnesota. He has approximately 80 publications in the field of biochemistry. His research interests are in the areas of enzymes and intermediary metabolism. He is a recipient of the Merck Award, and of the which is given by the Canadian Institute of Chemistry, and of the Van Meter Award of the American Goiter Association. He is finally listed in American Men of Science. Ladies and gentlemen, will you welcome Dr. Sam Kirkwood.
Thank you.
Dr. Fritz, ladies and gentlemen, I never realized before what dull tools we evolutionists were, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Gish for pointing it out to me. Dr. Gish has been very careful that we understand that he presents us with only opinions from authorities in evolution, and that these people publish in evolutionary journals. However, we are always offered just a wee bit extra. He gives the impression that these people are very prestigious because he says so. And he also gives us the impression that the journals they publish in are equally prestigious. I might say that Dr. Gish is a great impressionist. His middle name should have been Monet. Now, it could just possibly be dangerous for me to have Dr. Gish in the place of evaluating quality on my side of the question. I would say that it was entirely analogous to putting the fox in charge of henhouse security. The consequences of such a decision could be momentous, especially for the chickens. Let me say that with respect to the value judgments that he has made on my side of the question, that I have heard of a person by the name of Sir Julian Huxley, FRS, KCB, and I just as soon not comment on the quality of the other persons to whom he has referred. And with respect to the tremendous prestige of that journal, Evolution, I will simply observe that it too publishes a fair percentage of crappy articles, just like the Ladies' Home Journal. Now, the Creation Research Society and Dr. Gish have billed this debate as a scientific discussion. I would say that it would be much more consistent with the principles of scientific discussion if he had merely stated the person's name and given us the journal reference and let us judge the quality of the evidence for ourselves. And I would urge the audience not to assume that just because Dr. Gish says so-and-so is an important evolutionist, that it be assumed that it is necessarily so. Now, again, this debate has been presented as a discussion between two scientific models. Let me make a few remarks on the nature of scientific models and the means whereby we judge them. Science is based on a very simple and, to me, a very beautiful idea. And this is the notion that however the matter which composes the universe was created, it was created in such a fashion that it obeys the same laws. And it is the purpose of science then and of the scientists to determine what these laws are. Now, this is no easy task, and one of the most popular ways of getting at this question is the so-called scientific model. Some scientist, on the basis of some fraction of the evidence, advances a model which he or she feels is in fair correspondence to the real world. This model is then exposed to the view of all of the people in science, and it is either quickly rejected on the basis of the fact that it doesn't correspond very well with the real world, or if it is decided that it does so, it is worked on by anybody who would care to do so, and attempts are made to improve it. Improvement meaning that it is brought in ever better correspondence with the real world. Now, notice the characteristics of this model. The first one is that it is generated by a human being and it has no authority other than the authority of a human being behind it. If a model doesn't correspond to this, it is not a scientific model. And I would point out to you that there are at least two things that it is not up to either Dr. Gish or myself to do. One of these is to change the rules concerning scientific models. These were determined and stated by the scientific community long before either of us was born, and they could only be changed by an action of the scientific community. The other thing that it is not up to either one of us to do is to tell God how he did anything. God did as he pleased, and all Dr. Gish and I can do is to find out how he did it. Okay. Now, if a scientific model is a product purely of human beings, it must most certainly be fallible, because human beings are fallible. It certainly cannot fit all of the evidence, because if it did, we would be at the end of all knowledge. We would understand everything. Now, on this basis, then, it is strictly illegal to criticize, in science I am talking about, it is strictly illegal to criticize a scientific model by reciting a series of facts that it will not fit, or if you prefer, will not explain. Because, in fact, by this process, we can explain away the very best scientific models that we have. Let me give you an example. One of the best models that we have is the model of the physical universe given to us originally by Sir Isaac Newton. Now, Newtonian physics will not explain all of the facts by a very long shot. But on this basis, it would be both irrational and dangerous to reject Newtonian physics. For instance, let us assume that a member of this audience on this basis decided to go to the top of Northrop and to jump off, under the assumption that since Newtonian physics will not fit all of the facts, that Sir Isaac was kidding us, and more particularly, he was kidding us with respect to the workings of the law of gravity. Just before that person hit the ground, they would have realized the error in their process of reasoning. Now, I would submit to you that Dr. Gish has spent a good 90% of his time this evening reciting a series of facts which he says the evolutionary model will not fit. And I am saying that this is not only not scientific, it is not cricket, but it is very good debating technique. And I would say that anybody with half an ear on their head should be well aware of the fact that Dr. Gish is a skilled debater. After all, he makes his living at it. Now, let me also observe that however important we think science is, most of us think that there are other things that are even more important. And we have models and documents connected with these things. But these things, as I refer to them, are not scientific models, and they're not scientific documents, and they should not be treated as such. Let me give you an example. The quality of mercy is not strained, it falleth as the gentle rain from heaven. That is a very famous statement in the English language. What would happen if I submitted that statement to an uncultured scientist, i.e., I am going to have this scientist judge the thing purely from the viewpoint of science, and ask him the question, what did he think of that as a scientific definition of mercy? His reply to me would be that it was ridiculous. Now, does this mean that mercy is ridiculous? And does this mean that this statement is ridiculous? And does this mean that we don't understand what we mean when we say mercy? Very far from it. This particular statement in 15 words says more about mercy than any scientist could write in 15 books, because the concept of mercy lies totally outside the range of science. And the only thing that is made to look silly by this comparison is the statement by the scientist, who obviously did not know what he was talking about. As another example, let me consider the Iliad and submit it to the same scientist and ask him what he thought of this as a scientific document. He would reply again that it is ridiculous. But this doesn't mean that it is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. It just means that that particular statement by the scientist was ridiculous. Now I come to the New and the Old Testaments. And before I deal with these, I would like to invite you to a detailed consideration of my name. Probably many of you know that Kirk is the Scottish word for church. And I will inform you that the significance of Kirkwood is upholder or pillar of the church. If you are wondering what particular church, it is the Scottish Presbyterian Church. My first name is an anglicized version of the Hebrew word Shmuel, which is generally translated favored of God. I tell these things to you so that you will know that I come from a brass-bound Protestant tradition, admittedly with some interesting overtones. I will also tell you that I consider religion to be an extremely important matter. And I will add further that I am very upset by anybody, any group of people, or any single person who present the Old and the New Testament as scientific documents. And I hope I have made the reason plain. Now, the Creation Research Society has the statement in its statement of belief, and I have lifted it out of context. We believe that the Bible is scientifically true. And I am simply informing you that I absolutely cannot agree with this position, nor can I agree with it being taught in the schools. Well, now let us consider Dr. Gish's model. Let me give it in his own words. It is from the book Evolution the Fossils Say No by Duane T. Gish, Ph.D., published by the Creation Life Publishers of San Diego, California. This is the book that is being sold this evening at a tremendous discount. In my case, that amounts, as I have already signaled to you, to an offer which I cannot possibly refuse, so I have a copy of the book. He is speaking of his model, and I now quote him exactly. The proponents of this model for interpreting geologic history believe the correct interpretation of Genesis requires acceptance of a creation spanning 6 24-hour days. Furthermore, the genealogies listed in Genesis and elsewhere in the Bible, it is believed, would restrict the time of creation to somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. That is, the starting point of Dr. Gish's model is that everything in the universe was created in 6 24-hour days, and that there is nothing in the universe that is probably older than 6,000 years, and most certainly not older than 10,000 years. Now, this time scale is so vastly different from the time scale accepted in science that it makes it very difficult for Dr. Gish and I to do anything much more than talk past each other. For instance, with this as the starting point of his model, he still talks to us of the universe being 5 billion light years across. Now, ladies and gentlemen, those were his very words, by the way. Ladies and gentlemen, if the universe is 5 billion light years across, and in fact I believe the astronomers assert that they can observe with their best instruments 7 billion light years, this means that when we look at those objects that are at that distance, we are looking at them 7 billion years ago. Not 6,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, 7 billion years ago. Notice that his whole discussion was carried on in my time frame, not his. This is certainly a very interesting matter. Now, to give you some idea of this tremendous discrepancy in time frame, let me very quickly go through the high points of the time frame which is accepted by scientists today. The astronomers tell us that the universe is somewhere between 15 and 20 billion years old. This is based on 2 different systems of dating. The physicists tell us that the Earth and the Moon, of which we now have samples, is 4.6 billion years old. This is based on radioisotopic dating. The geologists tell us, in contrast to what Dr. Gish has just said, that the oldest living forms on Earth are 3.2 billion years of age, and this is based on the geological column and also on isotopic dating, and they assert that the evolution of the multicelled organisms has taken place over a period of 600 million years. Dr. Gish actually quoted this figure. Going to the complete other end of the time scale, let me observe that present-day botanists inform us that we have living things, trees in existence right here in the United States of America, which are 8,500 years old. This is 2,500 years older than his most probable date for the beginning, and right in the middle of his total time span. Excuse me, I would like to get my glass of water. Thank you. On this basis, then, we obviously have some problems. Okay, now let us come to his criticism of the evolutionary model. Thank you very much. He first asserts that it flies in the face of the second law of thermodynamics. He told us a great deal about what thermodynamics has to say about closed systems, that is, systems that are closed to the flow of energy. And he said a little bit, but not much, about the behavior of open systems. The laws of thermodynamics, or let me just say thermodynamics, asserts that any open system, ladies and gentlemen, whether it is populated by living matter or by inanimate matter, can increase in complexity without limit. It, of course, does assert that closed systems can either stay at the same complexity or decrease. Now, he did point out to us that all living things are open systems. He did not stress, as well as I would have liked, the fact that the whole surface of the Earth is an open system. The atmosphere, the surface of the ground, and the oceans. And we know of dozens and dozens of inanimate systems that because they are located in this open system, they increase in complexity. Let me just discuss one with which we are all familiar. I will present it in a rather artificial setting, but we are all aware of the phenomena taking place in nature. Let us say that I had a container of about the size of this lectern, a rather stout one, and into this container I inserted a mixture of 2 volumes of hydrogen gas and 1 volume of oxygen gas. The system is totally inanimate. Now, this system would be highly random. The hydrogen atoms would be proceeding in a random fashion all through the container, and so would the oxygen atoms. Let us say now that I touched a match to this. This is why I need the container to be stout. And I further require that this container at the beginning and the end of the experiment be at minus 5 degrees Celsius. Think metric. You all know that immediately the match hit it, it would explode, and the temperature would go far above 5 degrees Celsius. Now, the condition of the material in the container immediately after the explosion is extremely interesting. Instead of being a random mixture of hydrogen and oxygen, it would now consist of what we call steam. And the hydrogen now and the oxygen would be arranged in a very precise order. Each oxygen would be flanked by 2 hydrogens, and the whole array would be at a precise angle, namely 109 degrees. This is a tremendous increase in the order of the system. Yet Dr. Gish asserts that it is against the second law, and yet we know that the thing occurs. Why does it occur? Because the system is open to the flow of energy. Okay? Now, I have specified that I am going at the end of the experiment to have this container at minus 5 degrees Celsius. So I start my refrigerator and start to pump heat out of the system. It is an open system, notice. As I pass below 100 degrees Celsius, an interesting change takes place. Instead of remaining as steam, the water condenses to liquid water. Now, you cannot tell it by examining it with the naked eye, but liquid water is much more highly organized, much more complex than is gaseous water, because the water molecules bond with each other and form, in fact, one gigantic, loose, organized molecule. Now, my refrigerator is still running because I am going to run it till I get down to minus 5 degrees. And as I pass 0, a very interesting thing happens. If I arrange it properly, of course, all of the water in the container becomes snowflakes. Each one a tremendously complex crystalline structure, and no snowflake like any other snowflake. Another tremendous increase in order. And yet Dr. Gish says that the laws of thermodynamics dictate that this will not take place. He also says that statistics tell us that it would not take place. Let me show you how he would approach this. He would say, what is the chance that by chance The system can arrange itself such that each oxygen is flanked by a hydrogen, and he would come out with the answer 1 in a jillion. Then we would ask him to calculate for us what is the chance that the water would arrange itself into one enormous liquid mobile molecule, and he would come out with the answer 1 in a jillion. And finally, if we would ask him to calculate the possibility that by chance the hydrogen and oxygen that were in the original container would arrange themselves to an incredible mass of highly organized snowflakes, of course it would come out 1 in 10 jillion. But in fact, we know that it happens. The assertion that it does not happen might sell in California, but it will not sell in Minnesota. Let me say that I really fear for Dr. Gish on this matter. We have every reason to believe that our Creator is tremendously proud of the second law. Otherwise, he would not have made us all obey it. And Dr. Gish is going to have to meet his Maker just like the rest of us, and he is going to have to do some tall old explaining on the question of the second law. I might say I am also going to have to do some tall old explaining, but I don't think it's going to be on the question of the second law. Now, with respect to things becoming more complex, let me deal with just one system to, I hope, make the point plain. Could I have the first slide, please, Rock? You are all well aware, I am sure, of the famous plant disease called tobacco mosaic. The causative agent is the tobacco mosaic virus, whose structure is shown in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. The structure is tremendously complex. It is made up of 2 chemical types, a large number of protein molecules that are shaped for all the world like a piece of pie with the point cut off, and a single molecule that looks like a piece of string, which is the famous substance ribose nucleic acid, RNA. And the protein subunits are built in an elaborate spiral tower, as you see, and the RNA is coiled within the structure. The complete structure at the bottom right is fully infective toward plants, and if put on a susceptible plant, will cause the mosaic disease. Now, if, as they say in the trade, this virus is placed in an unphysiological solution, that is, the concentration of hydrogen and several other ions are changed, it falls apart into its component units, i.e., this is not shown on the slide, by the way, it falls into a completely jumbled assembly of those protein blocks and a piece of RNA that looks for all the world like a string. Now, if you should happen to think that what I am going to describe shortly is a product of my overheated imagination, let me say that the whole this molecule is big enough, I should say this virus, if you prefer, is big enough to be clearly seen under the electron microscope, and every step of the self-assembly which I will describe has been observed to take place. The interesting thing occurs when I make the concentration of ions in the solution physiological again. The first thing that happens is that by the way, I should have mentioned that the jumbled assembly of protein molecules and the isolated RNA are not infective to plants. When I make the solution physiological, the first thing that happens is that the protein subunits assemble themselves into discs, some of which are seen in the upper left-hand corner. And the process can be stopped there. However, if it is allowed to continue, these disc-shaped pieces will reassemble themselves by stepping along each other to form what appear for all the world as being lock washers. You see these on the bottom left, and then the lock washers and the RNA reassemble themselves into the tower, and the virus then becomes fully infective again. Now, all of this is a chemical process, and according to Dr. Gish, is against the second law and is against the laws of probability, but it happens. We can see it under the electron microscope. Okay, he spent a lot of time on the fossil record, and I suppose I am going to have to do the same. Let me observe to you, however, that this is a rather odd situation. The people who deal with fossils are called paleontologists. Neither Dr. Gish nor myself have one shred of authority in the field of paleontology. That is, if a real paleontologist, and there are a few in the audience listening, hears either of us pronounce on fossils, they will attach just as much significance to that as they would attach to a clergyman or a farmer dissertating on the same subject. And it is rather odd then that for most of this exchange you are going to be treated to two biochemists telling you all about the fossils. Now, I would point out to you that this is not my doing. Dr. Gish challenged me, I did not challenge him, and he chose the ground upon which we will slug it out. Okay, what about the fossil record? First of all, he gives the impression that it is very complete. Let me point out to you that the discovery of a fossil is the result of two very rare events. First of all, we know that only a very small proportion of those things that die become fossilized. Most of them have their structure totally disrupted. Secondly, we know that while the paleontologists are willing to spend a lot of energy and a fair amount of money at digging for fossils, they invariably dig where fossils have been observed at the surface. And as a result of this, we know very well that they have as yet seen only a very minute fraction of the fossils in existence, and that no matter how hard they work, we will never be able to see other than a minute fraction of the fossils that exist. Just to give you an example of the magnitude of the situation, ladies and gentlemen, let me point out to you that we possess most of the vertebrate paleontologists in the world. I refer to the United States of America, and that amounts to exactly 150. And you might ask yourself the question, and by the way, that's more than we've ever possessed in the past. You might ask yourself the question, just what sort of a representation of life in the past might these people be able to turn up if they worked very hard? Now, what I am saying is effectively just the reverse of what Dr. Gish said. The fossil record is expected to be very incomplete, and would be expected to have large numbers of what he calls gaps for this reason. I would point out to you that Charles Darwin, who first gave us the evolutionary model, did not base it at all on the fossil record because he knew this fact. Charles was no dummy, believe me. Now, in his book, Dr. Gish actually discusses this question, and I would ask you to pay, I'm going to quote him, and I would ask you to pay close attention to this because it is an example of extremely close reasoning. The fossil record ought to produce thousands upon thousands of transitional or in-between forms. He has already told us this. It is true that according to evolutionary geology, only a tiny fraction of all plants and animals that have ever existed would have been preserved as fossils. He agrees with me. It is also true that we have as yet uncovered only a small fraction of the fossils that are entombed in the rocks. Again, he agrees with me. Now listen to his conclusion. We have nevertheless recovered a good representative number of the fossils that exist. If you didn't get it, perhaps I should read it again. I go on to quote, sampling of the fossil record has now been so thorough that appeals to the imperfections in the record are no longer valid. It seems clear then that after 150 years of intense searching, a large number of obvious transitional forms would have been discovered if the predictions of evolutionary theory are valid. We have, for example, discovered literally billions of fossils of the ancient invertebrates. Now let us just take that statement. We have discovered billions of fossils of the ancient invertebrates. It is a fair assumption that there are no more than 2,000 paleontologists in the world. Let us say, I'm going to make one of my statistical calculations. Let us say that we assign those paleontologists the task of discovering a new fossil every day. Now, when somebody tells me they discover a fossil, I understand them to mean that they have had their hands on a fossil and they have examined it. So I'm going to assign these people the task of discovering a fossil every day. And instead of billions of fossils, I'm only going to take a billion fossils, and I am now going to calculate how long it is going to take them to discover a billion fossils. I did this on my handy-dandy pocket calculator last night, and the answer is 1,369.863013 years. I'm sorry, but my calculator is only good to 10 places. Now, either there's something wrong with that statement, or in fact, we haven't discovered a billion fossils. And in fact, we know with reasonable accuracy exactly how many fossils we have discovered. The number is the number of fossils which are presently in museums, and it is very close to 225,000, not billions. Dr. Gish is a trained biochemist, but when he gets into this area of science, he becomes, it seems to me, oddly emotional and quite unobjective. Okay, what about his argument that we should find millions upon millions of transition forms in the fossil record? Let me present to you what I think is quite a closely reasoned argument that, interestingly enough, leads to precisely the opposite conclusion to that which he reaches. Charles Darwin told us that the basis of evolution was alteration and natural selection. The natural selection was done by the environment. the environment selected from the available population those members who were most fit in that environment. As the environment changed, then the population changed. Now, let us take a very famous transition, in many ways the most famous transition, the transition from, this is now a transition asserted by the evolutionists, of course, the transition of the fish to the amphibians. We know that not all fish evolved to amphibians because we have dozens upon dozens of perfectly good species of fish all around us at the moment. These obviously did not evolve to anything other than fish. If Darwin is correct, what must have happened was that the environment at some point put pressure on a fish population to cause it to be selected in the direction of forms which could live on land. Now, I would submit to you, well, let me just give you the evolutionary model, because the environmental aspects of it are borne out by the fossil record. This transition is found to occur in the Devonian, and it is asserted on the basis of geological evidence that there were periodical droughts in the Devonian, and the evolutionists assert that a certain very special type of freshwater fish was the one that evolved. The picture given then is that this freshwater fish was periodically stressed by these droughts in the environment, and this put selective pressure on these fish that caused them to evolve characteristics that would permit them to eventually exist on land. Now, let us say that we are right in the middle of the transition. Of all of the fish in existence on Earth, what proportion would be composed, or I guess it's a good way to put it, what proportion would be composed of this particular group? And I would say that it would be an extremely small proportion. Most of the fish, for instance, all of the ones in the ocean, were having no trouble with drought whatever. Now, the chances then that we will find a fossil of those evolving forms are obviously directly proportional to the percentage of the population they make up. And if that percentage is tiny, and I claim that it obviously would be, then the chances of us finding that fossil would be very small. Unless, of course, we went precisely to the right place. So, I would contend, and so would the other evolutionists, that we would not expect to find millions and millions of transition forms in the fossil record. We would expect to find a few. Now, let me go through this fish to amphibian transition. And since Dr. Gish has used pictures from Romer, a well-known paleontologist and a convinced evolutionist, I will reciprocate by using pictures from Dr. Gish's book, The Fossils Say No! Exclamation point. Could I have the next slide, Rock? Before I show you Dr. Gish's illustration, I want to show you the difference between his picture of the fossil record and that accepted by conventional science. He says that life appeared suddenly at that region called the Cambrian, Precambrian boundary there, and I believe he made the statement that there is no record of multicell life before that time. The evolutionists would disagree with him, and so would the paleontologists. You see a band there labeled Ediacara Hills. That is a find of Precambrian fossils of multicelled organisms, some of which were more than a foot across. This does not agree with Dr. Gish's picture. Now, notice right down to 3.2 billion years ago. Now remember, Dr. Gish says nothing is any older than 10,000 years. Right down to 3.2 billion years ago, we have series of fossil finds. From 3.2 billion to that Ediacara formation, all of these forms of life are microorganisms. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's precisely what Darwin said. Darwin said that life began in the form of single-celled organisms and evolved. And we have the fig tree find, the southern Rhodesian algal limestones, the Witwatersrand system, the Gunflint iron formation in the northern part of our own state and in Ontario, Sahara algal limestones, and the nonsuch. Some of these microorganisms, the algal forms particularly, are so well preserved that they could be classified down almost to the species. So here there is just a disagreement on the facts between us. Now could I have the third slide, Rock? This is Dr. Gish's picture, and he simply says to us, look at that fish and look at that amphibian, and what reasonable person could assume that one evolved into the other suddenly? Now, when he uses this word suddenly, he often quotes it, as he did this evening, from perfectly acceptable paleontological sources. However, keep in mind that when a person uses the word suddenly, you should be aware, if you wish to understand what they mean, you should be aware of the frame of reference in which they make their remarks. Now, when Dr. Gish says suddenly, his frame of reference is on the order of 6,000 years. And therefore, when he says suddenly, he means approximately, I would think, what we usually understand by the term. But when Romer, the paleontologist, says suddenly, he is thinking in terms of 4.6 times 10 to the 9th years. Now, I have gone back in the book. I couldn't do it this evening because Dr. Gish was moving too quickly for me. I have gone back in the book and selected these quotations in the book that he has given on suddenly and explosively. In no case does it cover less than 1 million years. In many cases, in other words, when Romer says something appeared suddenly in the fossil record, he means it appeared over 1 million years, ladies and gentlemen, not 6,000. The shortest time I can find is 1 million. It averages around 5 million, and it can go as high as 30 million. Now, in the normal use of the word, the fossils, my hand on the connection. It's my sweaty hand on the connection. In normal use of the word suddenly, these things do not appear suddenly at all. Nevertheless, he invites us to consider how any reasonable person could think of the fish suddenly becoming the amphibian with no intermediate forms. Now, I would have to agree with him looking at it as it is presented there. It does seem a rather unreasonable proposition. Let me point out some things about this fish that Dr. Gish does not point out. It's quite different from fish that we're used to today. Instead of having its fins attached to the side of its body, it's got them out on the end of fleshy stalks. He might have commented as to what is in those fleshy stalks. Now, in this diagram, Dr. Gish has made a slight mistake. You will notice that somebody has defaced this particular copy of the book and written Areopid in the upper left-hand corner. That is not my handwriting. I never deface books. You will, of course, wish to know whose handwriting it is. It is the handwriting of one Robert Sloan. You will want to know who Robert Sloan is, and I will tell you he is a vertebrate paleontologist employed by the University of Minnesota. And when he wrote that, he wished to give you a message, me a message, and Dr. Gish a message that there had been a serious mistake made there. Instead of being a ichthyostegid amphibian, it is another amphibian which occurs 70 million years later in the fossil record. Now, to Dr. Gish's credit, I am pleased to observe in his slides this evening that he has corrected this, and the slide that he showed this evening is, in fact, the correct organism. Now, I would like to present you these same data from my point of view. I would like to take the actual fish, this is a generalized reconstruction, that the paleontologists say evolved into the amphibian. Could I have the slide 4, Rock? You notice that I show it in a little different position than does Dr. Gish. Now, you will say that it is surely my overheated imagination. How could those fish be up on the shore like that, standing on their fins? They would smother. Well, I will tell you they would not smother because they had lungs. Dr. Gish didn't tell us this. There is lots of geological evidence of this and lots of evidence from their anatomical structure. The stubs upon which their fins are located contain bones, ladies and gentlemen, and contained quite heavy musculature. We can tell this from the nature of the bones, and there's no question at all that they could have stood on their fins as they are shown there. And if this is not acceptable enough, let me say that we have fossilized footprints of these fish. Dr. Gish doesn't mention this in his book. Could I have slide 5, please, Rock? Now we will see the same organism that Dr. Gish showed us, one with the clothes off and the other with the clothes on. Notice that the generalized form of the body is very similar to the crossopterygian fish. By the way, to show you what charming names the paleontologists have, the fish is called Eusthenopteron, and this is called Ichthyostega. They have the same body form. The tail is fleshy in both cases. In the case of the crossopterygian fish, it had a fin above and below the tail that then extended over the end. This organism had a vestigial fin on the bottom of the tail, and you see it has a pretty fair fin on the top. Now, the paleontologists don't particularly go for comparisons of body outline like this because they regard it as being a little gauche. Let me show you the sort of comparison they make, and this time I will not compare this organism with my crossopterygian fish. I will compare Dr. Gish's organism 70 million years later in the fossil record with my crossopterygian fish. I guess I bobbled that a bit. It's my fish and his amphibian, and what I'm going to compare is the bone structure. The bone structure in the forefin of the fish with the bone structure in the foreleg of the amphibian. Could I have 6, please? Notice the marked similarity in bone structure. And in fact, the bone structure is so similar that in fact the terminology used is the same as is used in our own arms. Scapula being shoulder blade, humerus being the main bone of the upper arm, that's H, and the radius and the ulna. And notice that all of these bones are present in the amphibian, but they have been extended. We would say they have been extended by evolution. Now, Dr. Gish says that this can't be regarded as being evidence for transition forms. So could I have Rock slide 7? Now this is the forefin of a crossopterygian fish, and if I showed you a picture of this crossopterygian fish, you would not be able to distinguish it from Dr. Gish's. However, this fish had a very interesting thing. The big difference between the crossopterygian fin and the leg of the amphibian was the leg of the amphibian had evolved so the elbow joint could do this. This elbow joint, ladies and gentlemen, can do this. Could I have the next slide, please, Rock? This is the hind limb, and it has also a joint that can do this. In other words, this fish has the first known elbow joint and the first known ankle joint. And I would contend it is a perfectly good transitional form. It wasn't mentioned in the speech, and it isn't mentioned in the book. I wonder why. Finally, let me say that Dr. Gish told us that the feathers of Archaeopteryx, which the paleontologists say is a perfectly good transition form, were exactly like the feathers of a modern bird. How does he know? He has never seen the feathers of Archaeopteryx. All he has ever seen is a print in a piece of mud. Again, his objectivity seems to come to a low level when he gets emotionally involved in the argument. I see my time is about up, so I will stop on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kirkwood. Before we take our 10-minute recess, will you please remain in your seats and give the ushers a time to get in position, and then pass your question cards to your left. To your left. The ushers will get into position and will take them in the aisle. And after they've done that, we will have a 10-minute recess. So please remain where you are for the moment. After our recess, there will be 2 rounds of rebuttals. The first 15 minutes to each speaker, the second 5 minutes for each speaker.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned when we began this evening, I was trusting that we'd keep this discussion this evening at an academic level, that we'd develop the merits of our case based upon the facts and the evidence, and keep personalities out of the discussion and refrain from casting aspersions on one another. I'm afraid, however, there's been a little slippage in that respect, but I want you to know I have no intention of following that procedure. If I should do so, it would constitute an admission on my part that I have no case, that it's weak, and therefore I must indulge in personalities and things of this kind. I'm going to base my case on the evidence and not anything of any other kind. Now, about quoting authorities, yes, I have. And I must let you know that these people are authorities, that they have done a tremendous amount of research in their particular fields. I'm not going to get up here and quote creationists to support my case. I'm going to quote evolutionists as to the nature of the facts. And I emphasize that I was going to do that. I pointed out that we might differ as far as our conclusions or deductions from that evidence is concerned, but I wanted to quote these people as what the facts are. And certainly I want to give tremendous authority to Sir Solly Zuckerman, Lord Zuckerman, a man who was knighted for his tremendous research in anatomy, unrelated fields, a man who is qualified, if anyone is, to speak on Australopithecus. Therefore, I use this man to support my case, say exactly what this man says, not what I say. I am not a paleontologist, it's true, neither is Dr. Kirkwood, but I am a scientist. I'm trained to think scientifically, and I can read, as you can read and you can hear. What's the use of us being here tonight to even listen to this case? Perhaps none of you are a paleontologist or biochemist or physiologist or anatomist or anything else, but you can listen, you're intelligent, you can understand, and when you've heard the evidence, I feel that you can make an intelligent decision. Now, as far as thermodynamics is concerned, Dr. Kirkwood has simply not dealt with the evidence. Now listen, if we can settle this matter of evolution and thermodynamics by the combustion of oxygen with hydrogen, the crystallization of water and so forth, and that's all there is to it, may I ask you a question? Why have so many articles and so many books been written on this problem of thermodynamics and evolution? Why has a leading thermodynamicist said that this is one of the remaining major unsolved problems, the relationship between thermodynamics and the origin of biological order? Of course it's a tremendous problem. This crystallization does not solve the problem at all. Prigogine, who is one of the leading authorities in this field, in an article in which she published in Physics Today in December of 1942, said explicitly a crystal had nothing to do with the origin of biological order. When you get crystallization, you're dead, you're at equilibrium. There's no energy exchange in a crystal. There is no complexity in a crystal. There is perfect regularity. That's just the opposite you must have for a living thing. Of course, oxygen will combine with hydrogen. It always combines and forms water. That's all it can do. It can't evolve to complex things and become living things. This is completely irrelevant to the discussion tonight. I don't care whether you even call it a law. The authorities have said out there in the real world, the more probable state of matter is always a random state. That's the way everything tends to go in this world. And Dr. Kirkwood, as a biochemist, knows that. If he isolates a biologically active compound, all of us as biochemists, we keep it cold, we freeze it, we put it in the deep freeze, we put it under nitrogen, put it in a capsule under nitrogen or something like that. We do everything we can to protect that natural substance from the deteriorative action of nature, but we cannot succeed. Eventually, we lose the biological activity of that substance. I've worked with hormone. I know that we lose the biological activity. Why? Why is this true? Why can't we preserve the biological activity? Why can't we, as a matter of fact, enhance it? Why doesn't it spontaneously grow or increase? No, it does not. It spontaneously decreases. Now, TMV, of course TMV, tobacco mosaic virus, reassembles itself. I spent 4 years on the staff of the virus laboratory at the University of California, working on tobacco mosaic virus and its structure. Of course it reassembles. Why does it do that? Because it is programmed in the RNA of that virus. It is already programmed there in the unique sequence of those nucleotides. And of course the protein, it must be unique. RNA virus material will not reassemble any protein material. It must be the TMV protein material, which is absolutely unique in its sequence. Of course it will do that. but because it's already programmed. You see, that's what we have pointed out. You must have a program, and you must have this machinery. When you have it, of course it will happen. But you just take any old RNA, just take any nucleotides, any old sequence, and mix them up and synthesize them, you're not going to get anything that will self-assemble. It is absolutely unique, you see, to these viruses because it's been built in. No, this discussion has no relevance to the spontaneous origin of biological order, ladies and gentlemen. As biochemists, why don't we talk about the origin of protein, the origin of RNA and DNA, the arrangement of the nucleotides to form an RNA. There are 6,600 nucleotides in RNA, precisely ordered, 6,600. And we treated that virus with a chemical, and you alter one of those RNA, and you may destroy all of the activity. Just one out of 6,600. That's what we should be talking about here this evening, the spontaneous self-assembly of nucleotides to form active material, or the spontaneous self-assembly of amino acids to form a protein. That does not happen. It never happened. Proteins spontaneously deteriorate. They will release their amino acids, and the amino acids will deteriorate, but they never spontaneously assemble in this precise order. I know I spent many years assembling amino acids in precise order. It took me 3 years, as a matter of fact, to put 17 amino acids together in precise order. 3 years. Now, it doesn't take quite that long today with refined techniques, but it takes teams of scientists months and months and months to put these things together in precise order. And they end up with a lot of junk, but the cell does it perfectly because it is equipped to do so. No, these things do not happen spontaneously, not at all. Now about the fish. May I have that slide, please? Slide number 2. Now here I want to show you the picture of the picture of the fish that Dr. Kirkwood showed you from my book was taken from the book by George Gaylord Simpson, famous evolutionist, Life of the Past. That is Simpson's picture. It is not mine. Now it's his flesh reconstructions and not mine. Now I want to show you again the picture of that fish. No, we've got to go. It's number 36 on the tray, Vince. And I want to show you the picture of that fish again. There's the fish. Now look at the pelvic bone in that fish. Look at the pelvic bone in that fish. Notice how it is very small, loosely embedded in muscle. There is no attachment between the pelvic bone of the fish and the vertebral column. You don't need any. The fins do not support the weight of the body. They cannot support the weight of the body. They're not made to do that. But the pelvic bone of this amphibian, which is the world's oldest known amphibian, found in Romer's book, has a very large pelvis firmly attached to the vertebral column. That is the kind of anatomy you must have to walk, and the kind of anatomy is possessed by all amphibians, living or fossil. Next slide, please. Oh, so let's leave it right there now. Notice those bones. Sorry, there's a few bones in there. Now you have to have a tremendous amount of imagination, or at least, let's put it this way, you have to have a tremendous amount of evolution to get from that structure to feet and legs. I think we'd all agree to that. 30 million years of evolution, as a matter of fact, in not one single transitional form. Now there are many fossils in the fossil record. When I said billions of fossils of invertebrates, I did not say billions of different kinds of invertebrates, but billions of total invertebrates. You can look at a hillside and literally see billions and billions of these things. We have plenty of fossils. As a matter of fact, in the Karoo Formation of South Africa, it was estimated by Dr. Robert Broom, an evolutionist, a paleontologist, that if you could dig out every fossil of vertebrate animals, now I don't mean little marine organisms, I mean vertebrates, reptiles and things like that. If you could dig out every one of these fossils, you would produce 800 billion vertebrate fossils. 800 billion. Of course, no one has ever done that. But we have dug out many of these, and so we do have a representative sampling. When Harris and Gallup takes a poll, they don't interview 220 million people, ladies and gentlemen. They may interview no more than 2,000. But that is an adequate representative sample. And that's what I'm talking about. We have plenty of fossils, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have the transitional forms. That's the problem. Next slide. Well, here's the fish. Now, I want to show you now, there's the fish. There's the actual picture of that fish in the flesh. That's no reconstruction. That's the fish. Now that fish cannot walk. It's not equipped to walk. Next slide, please. Here's a slide taken from the American Museum. Sorry, no, I want that. Go on there. Taken from the Chicago Museum of Natural History, their exhibit on the fish to amphibian. Oh, you got it upside down. That's all right. Leave it that way. Just focus it, please. We're going to have to read this upside down. Will you sharpen that up, please? Now, here is the picture. Well, we'll get it. Give me a little extra time for this mix-up, would you please? Now, let me just say this. Dr. Kirkwood said we have fossilized footprints of fish. Did that sink in? Fossilized footprints of fish. I didn't even know fish had feet, but let alone finding fossilized footprints. Now, I don't know what we're talking about here. Fishes don't have feet. They have scales. And we found nothing in the fossil record outside of these fossilized fins, certainly not feet. Now, here's the exhibit, the cross-section of fish at the pelvic region. The fins do not support the weight of the body. The fins serve only for balancing and steering. The pelvic bones are small and loosely embedded in muscle. That's true of all fishes, living or fossil. There's no connection between the pelvic bone of a fish and the vertebral column. You don't need any. Now look at the cross-section of amphibian. The limbs support the weight of the body. The pelvic bones are enlarged and firmly attached to the vertebral column. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the anatomy of all amphibians, living or fossil, and there are no transitional forms. The picture of a fish getting out and crawling on land is pure fraud. That's pure imagination. No fish can do that. The walking catfish of Florida do not walk. They get out and slither on their belly. They cannot walk. They can stay out of the water as long as their gills are moist and they can absorb oxygen from the air, but they do not walk. They cannot walk. There is no such creature. There's this tremendous difference. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I quoted certain authorities on the fossil record. Simpson himself says that the gaps at the level of the orders, classes, and phyla are systematic and almost always large. That's the fossil. I don't have to explain the fossil record, ladies and gentlemen. The evolutionist has to explain it. Creationists predict it on the basis of their model. Now, finally, about this matter of time. I don't care how old this earth is, whether it's 10,000 years old, 10 million years old, or 10 billion years old, the evidence for creation remains just as solid. Now, I use the evolutionary time scale, ladies and gentlemen. I have to. I can't discuss the evolutionary model without using their time scale. I'm saying that even if we had that amount of time, even if we make these assumptions, the data does not fit the model. Now, there's much evidence, by the way, of a young Earth. But I'm not going to base my case on that at all. There are certain assumptions in all dating methods. The radioactive dating methods involve certain basic assumptions you have to make. Nobody was there when the rock formed. We don't know how much lead was in the rock to begin with. You make assumptions, and those assumptions simply do not fit the fact. And there's much evidence for a young Earth, perhaps I can discuss later. The amount of helium produced by radioactive decay of uranium and thorium, for example. In 4.5 billion years, we would literally need 100,000 times or more helium to have 4.5 billion years. Helium is produced 6, 7, or 8 atoms for every atom of lead. That gives a very young age for the Earth. But I'm not going to base my case on any particular age. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. And now, Dr. Kirkwood with the first negative rebuttal.
If he had to use my time scale to discuss my model, why did I not have to use his time scale to discuss his? Now, Dr. Gish has challenged me to discuss the assembly of biological, self-assembly of biological molecules, saying that was a fit thing to discuss. I would agree with him. Why did he not discuss it instead of focusing on the fossil record. Let me discuss it now. Could I have slide 15, please, Rock? Ladies and gentlemen, the astronomers tell us that by radio telescopy they can unerringly detect and analyze for molecules at fantastic distances in space. And on this slide are listed those organic molecules, those carbon compounds, which had been detected up to the year 1972. Now, I would particularly direct your attention to the fifth one down, which I believe is ammonia, and how I wish I was out. Oh, the next one after that again, the one underwater, formaldehyde. Now, there is no question that these substances exist in space, and they have resulted by spontaneous processes, certainly in the case of the formaldehyde, from the substance methane. Now, let me show you what formaldehyde will do in the way of self-assembly in an open system. Could I have 16, please, Rock? Formaldehyde, and again, this has been observed in the laboratory repeatedly, will self-assemble to the naturally occurring carbohydrate fructose. Now, I submit it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that structure over fructose is a great deal more complicated. It contains a great deal more order than does the formaldehyde. And that self-assembly takes place. It is not contrary to thermodynamics, and it is not consideration. On top of that, the fructose will change glucose and now those three carbohydrates are the major 6 carbon sugars in nature, and they assemble from formaldehyde. So I will assert that molecules of biological importance self-assemble. It is on the slide, and I do not think that Dr. Gish can deny that these are solid experimental results. You will not get the self-assembly in a closed system, but you will get the self-assembly in an open system. Now, Dr. Gish has charged me with argument ad hominem. I would submit that he has said some very hard things about evolutionists and paleontologists, and in fact he raised the issue of a hoax in connection with the Piltdown Man to show us that the paleontologists obviously do not know what they are talking about. Let's just go over this Piltdown hoax for a moment, because I think, in fact, the paleontologists come out of the thing smelling relatively like a rose. The hoax was done, by the way, not by a paleontologist. It was done by a physician. In saying this, of course, I should quickly add that some of my best friends are physicians. It was admittedly accepted by a very prestigious British paleontologist and immediately stashed in a museum. Now, Dr. Gish asserted that it was accepted as a human fossil by everybody in the business. I think that is accurate. This is the impression he gave. That is definitely not true, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you want to check this, just do the following. The University of Minnesota has a very famous anthropologist. His name is E. Adamson Hobel. Dr. Hobel, among other things, is very famous for his textbook in anthropology, in which he has discussed the Piltdown Man in every edition. Now, I would suggest to you that you go back, which you can easily do in this university, and get a copy of Hobel's text that was published prior to the revelation of the Piltdown hoax, and see if this eminent American authority accepted it as a humanoid fossil. He does not, I assert, and you can easily check me. Now, why was the thing finally checked chemically to determine whether it was a hoax or not? The answer is that very few paleontologists, as a percentage of the whole group of paleontologists, accepted it as being genuine. And there was a continuous hubbub with respect to this question. And in fact, this is an example of nationalism in science, because in fact the only significant group of paleontologists that accepted it were Englishmen. It had been discovered in England. The hubbub about it became so great that finally a young English paleontologist insisted that the museum give it up for a fluorine analysis, which showed it to be a fake. Now I would like to deal with another hoax. To hoax is human, ladies and gentlemen. There have been many, many hoaxes. The textbook which the Creation Research Society, and which Dr. Gish, I think, wishes to have adopted in our schools to give equal time to his model, contains an assertion in it that in Texas there is a fossilized dinosaur track. And by the way, let me apologize for my error. I shouldn't have said footprint. I should have said fin print. A very bad slip, which I freely admit. This particular thing I'm referring to, though, is fossilized dinosaur tracks in Texas. It is asserted in the textbook that right in the dinosaur track there occur human footprints. It is asserted that this is in favor of the creationist model because it proves that men and dinosaurs existed contemporaneously on Earth. And it further points out that these human footprints are of gigantic size, which squares with the statement in the Old Testament that the men of old were giants in size. Now, I am not holding up the Old Testament to ridicule. I have as high opinion of it as Dr. Gish. Of that I am damn sure. Now, let me read you a statement concerning this thing in the textbook from Professor Keith Young. He is professor of geology in the Department of Geological Sciences of the University of Texas at Austin. He was asked to check the authenticity of this fossil. He says, I have visited the Glen Rose. I agree with you completely. I have visited the Glen Rose locality several times. Never have I been shown nor have I seen human footprints in association with dinosaur tracks, although I've seen many dinosaur tracks. He goes on to say, the tracks of the men, he is now referring to the photographic evidence presented by the Creation Research Society. By the way, this photographic evidence is not in the textbook, but it has been published in some of their other publications. The tracks of the men are chiseled cleanly, whereas those of even the smallest dinosaurs were made in the soft mud, and the soft mud rolled back into the track after the foot left and deformed the track. For this reason, it is obvious that the dinosaur tracks and the human tracks were made under greatly different conditions. And finally, he says this: my only conclusion has been and is now, without even considering the anomalous size of the tracks and the geological conditions, that the human tracks are a hoax, and a very poorly done hoax at that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I wish to put in the textbooks. Dr. Gish raised the matter of hoaxes. I did not. I would point out to you that in this indoctrination session tomorrow, and I believe that as an accurate description, there will be a movie shown, and it is called Footprints in Stone. I would be very interested to see what the nature of this movie is, and I'll leave the matter right at that point.
Thank you, Dr. Kirkwood. And now, Dr. Gish with the second affirmative rebuttal, 5 minutes.
Since we did not come here this evening to debate the Bible, I'm not going to attempt to give a defense of the Bible except to say this: yes, the Bible is not a book of science, but my personal examination of the Bible as a scientist and comparing the facts that are stated there and the facts of science, I find no contradiction between the facts of science when these facts are correctly interpreted and the Bible when it is correctly interpreted. Now, and I'm happy that in our democratic society we can take any view of the Bible that we so choose. But that's my own observation as a scientist. Now, as far as the origin of life is concerned and these chemical experiments, I'd like to have about an hour to talk about those experiments. Of course, an organic chemist can go in the laboratory and go through certain exercises in organic chemistry, and you can make certain things happen by your procedures and your apparatus. If you trap out the product, for example, such as Miller did in his experiment, trap out the product, the moment a smidgen of product was formed, you immediately trap out the product, you isolate it from the energy source, then the product will accumulate, and after a week or two you might have a detectable quantity of product. But ladies and gentlemen, if that product is in turn subjected to electrical discharge or ultraviolet light, whatever it has, whatever it may be, the rate of destruction of these products so far exceeds the rate of synthesis or formation, you have no detectable quantity of product. Based upon proved principles of thermodynamics and kinetics, chemical thermodynamics and chemical kinetics, the physical chemist can give no encouragement to this sort of thing beyond what an organic chemist can accomplish in the laboratory. Now, as far as this Piltdown hoax is concerned, ladies and gentlemen, I brought up this not to charge evolutionists with hoaxes. It wasn't even it was an evolutionist, of course, but it might not have been authority. We don't know who perpetrated the hoax, but the point was it succeeded in fooling the world's greatest authority. The consensus of the authorities was genuine. I have a review published in 1964 in Nature by Dr. Hawks. Dr. Hawks says, for example, to look back over the bold claims and subtle anatomical distinctions made by some of our greatest authorities concerning the recent human skull and modern ape's jaw, which together compose Piltdown man, rouses either joy or pain, according to one speaking for scientists. And Lord Zuckerman says, what of the distinguished anatomists who were absolutely certain that whatever resemblance the jaw might have to an ape, the specimen was really human, and so forth and so on. The authorities, this was the consensus of the authorities. It was not the re-evaluation by anthropologists which exposed the hoax, ladies and gentlemen. It was the fact that the bones were analyzed for fluorine and showed that the bones had no fluorine in them. They could not be fossils at all. They could not be old at all. Then and only then were the bones re-examined and shown to be a hoax. It was not the cleverness of the anthropologist at all. Now about these dinosaur footprints. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at those footprints, they're indistinguishable from man. They have 5 toes, ball and heel, and also that is the human footprints found with these dinosaur footprints. And I do invite you tomorrow to come and see the film and judge for yourself. And hear the testimony of a variety of experts who viewed these things. Now, it's amazing to me. You can find the dinosaur footprints, and everybody recognizes them as dinosaur. Here's the man track, but they're denied to be man track. And in spite of that, we can find footprints of fishes in the fossil record. Now, let me close. Let me summarize, ladies and gentlemen, what I've done here tonight. What I'm pleading for. I'm pleading for a hearing for the creationist position. I'm not suggesting we bring the Bible, the book of Genesis, into our public schools. I'm suggesting that we hear both sides of this question, just as we have tonight, that we do it on a scholarly level, that we lay out all the evidence, all the facts, and then give the students an opportunity to study these facts, all of the evidence, and in an unbiased, unprejudiced manner. And then the student has been subjected to a genuine educational process. He's not been brainwashed or indoctrinated in any particular philosophy or any point of view. And then he can decide for himself. Now, I feel that would be fully in accord with academic freedom, with religious freedom, and with the highest ideals of our American educational system. Thank you very much.
Finally, Dr. Kirkwood with the second negative rebuttal. Again, 5 minutes.
I think on this question of the hoax that I have alleged, indeed it should be looked at dispassionately. I think a group of people representative of the Creation Research Society and a group of people representative, say, of the National Academy of Sciences or some other body, recognized body of science, should go to the place on the ground where this is supposed to occur. Now, the professor at the Texas University says it does not occur on the ground. Let us have this is how things are done in science. Let us have an impartial commission with representation on both sides go to this place where the human footprints occur on the ground with fossilized dinosaur tracks, and we will all soon know the truth or otherwise of this assertion. This is what happened to the Piltdown man. After all, somebody did doubt it, or they wouldn't have been able to pry it out of the museum. And this is what should happen in the case of this particular piece of evidence, which I am saying is a hoax. Now, let me deal with just one other thing. Dr. Gish asserts that my self-assemblies won't take place in the real world because in the real world, the substances would be all destroyed by, he used the terms ultraviolet radiation and high energy discharge, if I remember rightly, because there was no sink. Now, he was referring to the Miller experiment. Let me tell you about the sink that exists in the real world. It is the claim of the people working in this area that these changes took place high in the Earth's atmosphere. The substances are all water soluble, and they would have immediately been fed into the oceans by the rain, and there they would have been protected from ultraviolet light and high energy electric discharge. The oceans of the Earth are a perfect sync for this process, but I didn't notice Dr. Gish drawing this to our attention. He said instead, there are no sinks. Now, throughout his talk, he has flown in the face of just about every type of scientific authority that there is, and asserted in his opinion, I agree with you completely. I have a calibrated stopwatch. He apparently does too. He has asserted that they are repeatedly wrong. Now, we are all subject to error. You've just seen me make one here tonight. And I would just submit that perhaps, since these dozens of scientists assert these things one way and Dr. Gish says they're another, that there might just possibly be a point on my side of the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kirkwood. Now we're to have 5 minutes to get up and stretch and relax for a moment for questions from the audience. Each speaker has a stack of questions that have been assembled by teams of representatives from each side. We will begin with the affirmative and then move to the negative. Each speaker will have an opportunity to speak for 3 minutes in response to the question. His opponent will have another 3 minutes to respond, and if it's required or seems necessary, there will be a chance for a short response to the comment. And we'll go from affirmative to negative, but we will conclude no later than 11 o'clock. Dr. Gish?
I'm going to just state this. It's really not a question. I'm going to state this. It's really not a question. I'll go on the next one then. It just says, is there a list anywhere of the references you gave during your lecture? Yes, there are. If any of you would like to have these references, I do have. Law was not operating, of course, during the period of creation or spatial creation. We refer to it as spatial creation because we believe spatial processes were in operation at that time, which are not operating now in the present world. We believe the operation of the second law came subsequent to this time. As we pointed out, if anything occurred since creation to alter the original created state, it could only produce a deteriorative effect and not an upward or creative effect. And that is what we see now in this world. And I won't go into what caused these changes, because that gets into the theological and is not appropriate for this debate tonight. But we believe the deteriorative processes that we see operate in the world came subsequent to the creation. And indeed, there is no doubt about it that the universe is deteriorating. I quoted Isaac Asimov, who said that the universe is constantly beginning more and more disorderly.
The only response I will make is that the argument as applied to the universe is perfectly correct. The universe, insofar as we know, is a closed system, and in total order is decreasing. In parts of the system, as I have pointed out, here on Earth, for instance, it is increasing, and it is perfectly consistent with thermodynamics.
Well, let me just respond to that again. Just merely having an open system, as Dr. Kirkwood is pointing out here, since certainly the Earth is open to the energy of the sun, and there is plenty of energy, there's no doubt about that, but that is totally insufficient to generate order. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you, why are scientists so dreadfully afraid of any decrease in the layer of ozone around the Earth? Simply because if that ozone layer is removed, the ultraviolet light of the sun will reach the surface of the Earth unchecked, and life will cease immediately, or almost immediately. From microbes to man, life cannot exist on this Earth in the presence of that sunlight. It will destroy everything here. Then how could life have arisen, you see, in the presence of that ultraviolet light? if it cannot exist in this presence.
Dr. Kirkwood, your question.
The question reads, if it is true that fish evolved to land species, why isn't it happening today? Why can't evidence be observed that it is now happening? Now, I think this question addresses itself to the observation of evolutionary processes in the present day. It is the contention of evolutionists that, in fact, the processes claimed by Darwin can be observed today. For instance, we have microorganisms which have developed resistance to drugs. We have insects that have developed resistance to DDT. All of these are claimed by the evolutionists to be examples of life moving under the pressure of natural selection. Now, admittedly, these changes are not large, but neither is the time scale over which they're observed. When you consider the changes that we have observed over a few minutes and ask yourself what could have happened in 4.6 times 10 to the 9th years, 4.5 billion years, then I think a different picture emerges.
Yes.
I'd like to respond to that. These very minor variations, I don't think anybody would claim, well, maybe they do claim that this is real evolution. But let me quote from a very well-known philosopher and historian of science, Dr. Marjorie Gren, G-R-E-N-E. As far as I know, she is an evolutionist. And in the journal or magazine Encounter in November of 1959, Dr. Gren published an article called The Faith of Darwinism. And she discusses much, and I wished I could read all of it. But talking about this variation among peppered moths, for example, she says, here, say the neo-Darwinians, is natural selection, that is, evolution actually going on. Put to this, we may answer, selection, yes. The color of moths or snails or mice is clearly controlled by visibility to predators. But evolution? Do these observations explain how in the first place there came to be any moths or snails or mice at all? By what right are we to extrapolate the pattern by which color or other such superficial characters are governed to the origin of species, let alone of classes, orders, phyla of living organisms? End of quote. And furthermore, in this article, she says the neo-Darwinian theory doesn't even address itself to this question of how we come to have mice and tigers and horses and men and things like that. It doesn't even ask the question. It deals with these very minor fluctuations within populations, which is not really relevant to this discussion this evening at all.
Dr. Kirkwood, a comment?
No, I just as soon not comment.
And your question, Dr. Gish.
Is Dr. Kirkwood's argument for an oceanic sink valid? Dr. Kirkwood has suggested that the amino acids filter down out of the atmosphere and dissolve in the water and there are protected. Now, first of all, it takes the half-time of fallout is 3 years, and practically everything is destroyed before it ever reaches the ocean. But now even the ocean is not a trap, it's not protection. The half-life of glycine, which is the stablest amino acids, is the most simple, therefore the stablest is only 30 years in water in the ocean. And that is extremely short on a geological time scale, incredibly short. This material will deteriorate very rapidly in the water since ultraviolet light does penetrate the water and it's completely mixed. Leslie Orgel and Stanley Miller in their book, The Origin of Life, say that these chemicals would have no chance at all surviving in an ocean at 25 degrees centigrade. They admit that. But they said perhaps if the ocean was 0 degrees, that would help a lot, and if it were minus 21 degrees, that would be a lot better. Well, now, where do you get an ocean at 0 degrees, let alone minus 21 degrees? At minus 21 degrees, the ocean would be frozen solid, absolutely one total iceberg. One thing that's not going to happen as an iceberg is the origin of life, that's for sure. Now, furthermore, if you did have a trap, and none had been visualized up to this point, you are dead. That's all the further you're going to go, you see. Let's suppose you could trap out these amino acids or sugars. You isolate it from the destructive energy source. Where are you going to go from there? How are you going to get the amino acids joined together to form protein? That takes energy. How are you going to get the sugars, phosphoric acid, and the purines and pyrimidines joined together to form nucleotide and get them to join together to form DNA and RNA? That takes energy. It's like pushing a car uphill. You've got to have energy. But now wait a minute, the moment you introduce energy, what you're going to do, you're going to destroy those products at such an enormous rate, you'll never get to the next step. And that's true of every step. You have to have energy. You're going uphill. You're trying to make these things do what they don't want to do, what they don't naturally do. You have to supply energy. But when you supply energy, you destroy these products at an enormous rate, and at a rate far, far in excess of the rate of synthesis. There's no way out of this dilemma. Absolutely no way out of it. The evolution of life is an impossibility based upon thermodynamics and chemical kinetics.
Dr. Gish asked me where I can find an ocean at 0 degrees. I will assert in any one of a number of places. He tells me that glycine has a half-life of X years in the oceans. He doesn't mention that it is the present oceans. The instability of glycine in the present ocean is because of the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere. He doesn't mention that we evolutionists claim, on the basis of very sound evidence, that 4.6 times 10 to the 9th years ago there was no oxygen in the atmosphere and the glycine would be stable. And the argument goes round and round and round. That's all I will say.
My discussion of the stability of glycine has nothing to do with the presence of oxygen whatsoever. These calculations were not based upon assuming any oxygen in the atmosphere. This is in the presence of the assumed primitive atmosphere, in the presence of the electrical discharges, ultraviolet light and heat and everything else that was present. These calculations are in an article by Dr. D.E. Hull in Nature, published in 1960. That's his calculations, it's not mine. That's his conclusions, and that's not mine. He is a physical chemist, and he said, guided by the proved principles of chemical thermodynamics and kinetics, the physical chemist can give no encouragement to these origin of life experiments. Because of this one important fact, the rate of destruction of any of these compounds by the energy is far, far exceeds their rate of synthesis. And so you cannot accumulate any significant quantity of this material whatsoever. And furthermore, he says it happened in the absence of oxygen. No oxygen, no ozone. That is for certain. If you have no ozone, then this destructive, short-range, high-energy ultraviolet light reaches the Earth unimpeded and would destroy everything. Life cannot exist in the absence of ozone. You have to have oxygen because ozone is O3. It's a triatomic form of oxygen. No oxygen, no ozone. No ozone, no life. No life whatsoever. In one of the NASA publications, they were commenting on the absence of organic material on Mars. And they said perhaps the reason that there's no organic material there, there's no atmosphere, and so the ultraviolet light of the sun would destroy everything in sight. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there were no oxygen in the atmosphere of the so-called primitive Earth. Now, and the so-called gases there would not strain out, protect the Earth. You have to have oxygen to do it, and you had no oxygen. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, may I ask, why is Mars completely devoid of organic material? And Earth is so rich in organic material if the Earth and Mars evolved from the same cloud of dust and gas. The evidence is contradictory to the assumptions of the evolutionary model.
The question reads, how do you account for the first spark of life? Don't you have to account for at least a starter force for that, or don't you know where it came from? Let me simply observe that I can assert nothing from a scientific standpoint with respect to first origins any more than Dr. Gish can. Now, it is my belief that our Creator did the whole thing, and He chose to do it by evolution. And I think it is a very beautiful process.
Well, of course, the evolutionists can say nothing about ultimate beginnings, and he doesn't pretend to try. Dr. Kirkwood has said he was not going to try either, and he does apparently accept that God began things, started things in the beginning, and then used this beautiful evolutionary process for his creation. I do not see it as a beautiful process, a process which is totally dependent on random mutations, which are mistakes. George Gaylord Simpson says they are mistakes, and a creator, omnipotent, omniscient creator, at least that's my conception of this creator, this God, a God who would use the most wasteful, inefficient, cruel method that he could possibly conceive in his creation, to me does not square with the attributes of God. And as a matter of fact, it is, and furthermore, it's not necessary to postulate such a thing, since the scientific evidence itself is so contradictory to the basic assumptions of this model.
Comment?
I would just comment that Dr. Gish is telling God how he did things again.
Dr. Gish, your question?
Yeah. Why are early stage embryos of various animals so similar? Why does human embryos possess gill slits and a tail? This refers to this old, totally discredited embryological recapitulation theory that the human embryo and other embryos recapitulate their evolutionary ancestry during development. Ladies and gentlemen, that's become thoroughly discredited. I have with me, for example, a paper published by Dr. Walter J. Bach of the Department of Biological Sciences of Columbia University, published in Science, 9th of May, 1969. Dr. Bach is an evolutionist, and he says the biogenetic law, that is this recapitulation theory, has become so deeply rooted in biological thought that it cannot be weeded out, in spite of its having been demonstrated to be wrong by numerous subsequent scholars, subsequent to Darwin, that is. This is a thoroughly discredited theory. Knowledgeable embryologists certainly don't believe it. The human embryo does not have gill slits. It has a series of bars and grooves in the neck region which have a superficial resemblance to structures in the neck region of the fish. In the fish, these develop into a slit into the throat and develop into gills. That area of the human does not open into the throat, therefore it is never a slit. It does not develop into gills or any other respiratory tissue, therefore it is not a gill. Now, if it's not a slit and it's not a gill, one thing is certain, it's not a gill slit. There's merely a superficial resemblance here. That area of the human develops into the lower jaw, structures of the middle ear, and very important glands and other things. There is no relationship whatsoever. Furthermore, in the human, the tongue in the embryo comes before the teeth, the heart before the blood vessels, the brain before the nerve cords, all out of order if the embryo is supposed to recapitulate. The heart in the embryo, human embryo, if it recapitulates its evolutionary, so-called evolutionary ancestor, it should start with one chamber, go to 2 chambers, to 3 to 4. As a matter of fact, it starts as a 2-chambered heart, which fuses to 1, which directly develops into a 4-chambered heart. It goes from 2 to 1 to 4. For this and many, many other reasons, this theory is completely and totally discredited and should not be used by any evolutionist as evidence for evolution.
Mr. Kirkwood, your response?
Is it used?
Yes.
I don't believe so.
You can,
Not these days,
I would
it is
suggest
not.
you...
One at a time, please.
I've made my
The
statement.
question I wanted to answer.
Your answer.
As a matter of fact, I have been around the country, engaged in many lectures and debates, and I have had many, many evolutionists use embryological recapitulation in these debates as evidence for evolution. You pick up your high school biology book and most of your college biology books and you read about this embryological recapitulation theory. I've had many, many students tell me that their professors are teaching it.
Dr. Kirkwood, your question.
The question reads, what is the mechanism which causes one form to change, mutate, to a different, more complex form? Now, in his answer to a previous question, Dr. Gish has stressed the random nature of mutation, and he's perfectly correct here. but it is not the claim of the neo-Darwinians that this is the whole explanation for evolution. It is the mutations that bring about the change. It is the environment which selects. Now, the behavior of the environment is not random. In some respects, it is highly directional. For instance, on this matter of the lack of oxygen in the atmosphere, which we have already discussed, there is clear evidence in the fossil record that the atmosphere contained no oxygen in the beginning, and that it has been acquiring oxygen slowly and steadily ever since. That directional change has exerted a selective pressure on all living things, and the results of this in terms of evolution can be clearly seen in biochemical mechanisms.
Response?
The evolutionists, of course, utilize natural selection as their mechanism. But now consider this. The mutation rate per gene, per generation, has been estimated to be somewhere between 1 out of 10,000 to 1 out of 1,000,000. Let's say it's 1 out of 100,000. That's somewhere in between. For one particular gene, one generation, you have one chance out of 100,000, only one individual out of 100,000 might have a mutation in that particular gene. But of these rare mutations, almost all are harmful. It'd be quite generous to say 1 out of 10,000 is beneficial. As a matter of fact, it's almost impossible to demonstrate a single beneficial mutation. But let's be generous and say 1 out of 10,000 of these very rare mutations are beneficial. The other 9,999 are bad. So you've got one good mutation out of 10,000 total mutations, and only 1 out of 100,000 has a mutation to begin with. That means you've got 1 out of 1 billion individuals that has a good mutation. 1 out of 1 billion. But you've got to have a tremendous series of these mutations in a single line of descent. The mutation only brings about an incredibly slight change. In fact, as a matter is, Stebbins says that the changes are so slight they're imperceptible. So you have an incredible number of the extremely rare mutations to change a fish into an amphibian. You've got 1 out of 1 billion individuals here, estimated, they say, might have a good mutation. 1 out of 1 billion. You got it now, but that one mutation must be linked with another good mutation. These must be linked with a third, with a fourth, with thousands and thousands of these. You got 1 out of 1 billion here, 1 out of 1 billion over here. What are the chances of getting those two individuals together to put the two good mutations in a single line? It's 1 out of 1 billion times 1 out of 1 billion. That is an incredibly slight probability, you see. But then you got to have a third, a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and so forth. The probability, you see, of getting these things together in one line of descent is absolutely impossible. And that's why these mathematicians are saying it will never happen. That this idea of natural selection with mutations is impossible to produce what we have in the world today in some 3 billion years. They said it would take billions of times longer than 3 billion years.
Dr. Gish insinuates that the mathematical community is in fundamental conflict with the claims of evolution. I say it is not so.
Well, if you say
many people can do calculations and get many results.
We are now within 10 minutes of concluding this evening's debate. I'm asked to request that the ushers take their positions at the doors to collect the questionnaires. Dr. Gish, your question.
Did you want me to comment on that, or should I?
I believe not.
Okay, all right.
We had a three-way exchange.
All right.
But your question.
Okay, so far the evidence for the theory of creation seems to be the lack of evidence for the theory of evolution. Is there any positive scientific evidence for creation? At the same time, isn't the evidence for evolution becoming more complete? Ladies and gentlemen, let me answer the last part first. As more and more evidence comes in, the difficulties of evolutionary theory become more and more drastic. The evidence from our space program, for example, evolutionists were certain, or almost certain, or hoping that they'd find life on Mars. They not only did not find life, they did not even find a trace of organic material. The evidence from our space program is making evolutionary theory much more difficult as time goes on. The searching goes on for transitional forms. As we find none, evolutionists now are being forced to revise their theory of evolution to account for the gaps. They're having more and more difficulties with the evidence. Now, I tried to stress here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence I was presenting was more than just negative evidence for or against evolution. It was positive evidence for creation. Forget the theory of evolution. Let's pretend nobody ever heard about it. Let's pretend we all are creationists. And we're going to ask ourselves, well, what would we expect to find in the fossil record on the basis of what we know to be true? Well, then go look at the fossil record. That is exactly what we find. That's positive evidence for creation. Go look at the laws of thermodynamics. Go look at natural processes. They are fully in accord with what we'd expect on the basis of creation. Look at all the evidence you see, ladies and gentlemen, that is positive evidence. If this universe could not have generated itself, and Dr. Kirkwood has admitted that it could not when he said no isolated closed system can order itself. And certainly if there is no God, then the universe is an isolated system. It cannot have ordered itself. It's impossible. It cannot do that. It is ordered, and therefore that is very positive evidence for creation. The origin of our universe absolutely requires a creator. No natural system, no isolated, certainly forgetting open and closed system, no isolated system can order itself. The solar system itself is essentially isolated from the rest of the universe. Our sun is 30 trillion miles away from the nearest star. What ordered the solar system? What introduced the order here, you see, that now we're supposed to be feeding on? How did that get ordered, you see? There is no answer to this question on the basis of mechanism, naturalism, and the facts of science. The origin by a supernatural creator is the only rational answer.
Comment on that.
I will simply state, and the scientific evidence supports me, that the solar system is totally open. The Earth is totally open. A tremendous stream of energy from the sun is continually coursing through the Earth. We're not talking about the universe becoming organized. We're talking about things on Earth becoming organized. That's all I will say.
Any response?
Yes, I'd like to respond to that. You say we've got energy coming from the sun. There's no one that denies that. There's a tremendous amount of energy, and there have been tremendously greater amount of energy in the beginning according to your model, with no ozone to filter out the short-range, high-energy ultraviolet light. You'd have much more energy. That's the problem. That energy is not constructive, it's destructive. We know that to be the case. How do you kill back? You want to kill bacterial culture? Expose it to ultraviolet light. That'll kill bacterial culture. When I was at the virus laboratory at the University of California, we had a negative pressure in our virus lab so that all air that left that building was sucked in and had to go out through a bank of ultraviolet light lamps on the roof to inactivate and destroy any pathogenic viruses. That ultraviolet light is going to destroy those things, you see. It's going to render them biologically inactive. How then could they have arisen in the presence of this ultraviolet light? Plenty of energy. You see, that's the very problem. It's the energy. Because this energy is destructive. You know, and I know, if you lay out in the sun all day, you're an open system. You absorb energy from the sun, but you don't increase in complexity. Your skin gets sunburned, it cracks, and chemical bonds are broken, and you end up with burns and blisters. Well, you've got plenty of energy. You're an open system. Why didn't you increase in complexity? No, you don't have the mechanism for it. You don't have the machinery. Only the green plant has that.
We are now at 5 minutes of 11. I would suggest that we have one more question and conclude with the negative side.
The question reads, given the tremendous number of complex life forms found today, it seems impossible to me that 4.6 billion years would be sufficient time to develop all the various structures. Please comment. I will proceed to do so. This is, of course, a matter of opinion. Apparently, it is the questioner's opinion that it is not enough time. It is my opinion it is enough time. Let me attempt to support this position. I have indicated that the fossil record indicates clearly that for the great majority of the 4.6 times 10 to the 9th years, life has been in the form of microorganisms. Present-day microorganisms, many of them, ladies and gentlemen, generate over a 20-minute period. And they reach incredible populations, millions per cubic centimeter. Imagine what the situation would be in the oceans. Now, if you have those tremendous populations of microorganisms with reproduction every 20 minutes, then the possibility of change is clearly enormous. It is still, however, a matter of opinion if there was time enough.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this comment about bacteria is entirely irrelevant. It's relevant as far as bacteria is concerned, but how do we get from that single-cell organism to man? You see, the generation time of monkeys and apes and snakes and things like that is not 20 minutes. It's in a matter of weeks or months or years, and sometimes many, many years. And yet we suppose we've got from that single-cell organism to man. No, of course. There would not be time. Now, don't take my word for it, ladies and gentlemen. Write to the Wistar Institute of Philadelphia, ask for their symposium on mathematical challenges to the neo-Darwinian interpretation of evolution, and see what these evolutionary mathematicians have to say. And by the way, some evolutionists maintain the reason we don't have transitional forms in the world today is because evolution is complete. It's already finished. We've tried everything. Everything that possibly could have happened, say as far as mutations are concerned, has already been tried. That's an incredible statement, ladies and gentlemen. The number of possible mutations is so incredibly large, it's almost infinite. For all practical purposes, it's infinite. And what has been tried, what could be tried in 5 billion years is almost insignificant compared to the total number of tries or the total number of things that could happen. And so there's a lot of things that could be tried yet and could happen. And that is the whole point of this. There are so many possible things that could happen, and yet so few could work, that the probability of getting that is just absolutely nil. Take the human eye. This incredibly complex human eye. Evolutionists believe that that eye evolved more than once. The vertebrate eye and the eye of the squid are nearly identical or very, very similar, but yet they supposedly evolved from a common ancestor which had no eyes. Now, to imagine that that eye might have evolved by chance once is incredible enough, but to believe that it happened twice, that really leaves you cold and shaking. And that is only one of the incredibly complex structures. The human brain. If you want to believe that your human brain with its 120 trillion connections evolved and developed by chance through these mistakes, you go ahead and believe it. But I find that to be more in the nature of 20th century mythology than science.
Dr. Kirkwood, do you have a brief final comment?
Well, I would say we do not evolve by chance. We evolve by selection from the environment. That's the difference between Charles Darwin and Duane Gish, and it's a big one.
Before we conclude tonight, and you have been a wonderful audience, I want to call upon Max Callan for an announcement from the Creation Research Society.
Thank you very much. You have been a wonderful audience. There are two things that I wanted to make clear. One is this teacher seminar tomorrow is at Highland Park Senior High School. It's at 1015 Snelling Avenue South. And we'll start at 8:30 in the morning and run till 5:30 in the afternoon. It might be of interest to some of you. It's not supported by or not sponsored necessarily by the Twin Cities Creation Science Association, but there will be a summer institute on scientific creationism presented by the Institute for Creation Research at Northwestern College, and this will take place on August 22nd through the 26th. There are brochures on the table in the lobby, so if you're interested, please pick one up. And thank both of you debaters. It was a very wonderful evening, and we appreciate it a great deal. Let's give them another big hand. Thank you. Good night.